Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was raised to be an amoral weapon. In a world where Orochimaru is Hokage and the hidden villages are ruled by tyrants, Tenten finds the lines between ally and enemy blurring when a desperate strategy lands her in the company of enigmatic strangers who wear black cloaks with red clouds. Welcome aboard! Chapter 6, Tested. Tenten among the Akatsuki, Week 2. After leaving the statue chamber, Tenten followed Sasori through the tunnels. The door they arrived at was different from the one he's taken her to get cleaned up and change. The door had a scorpion and a diamond carved into it, and swung open seemingly on its own when Sasori approached. "Come in, please," he said, allowing Tenten and Deidara to precede him inside before following them in. The door closed behind him with a clang. Looking around, Tenten's eyes widened in surprise. The living quarters she found herself in were surprisingly spacious for being carved out of solid rock. She stood in a large main living area furnished in the style of Sunagakure, with a few woven tapestries on the walls that depicted desert scenes. It looked like the homes of a few sand ninja Tenten had been invited into. One doorway on the far wall went back into a bedroom, while the one next to it opened onto a workshop that looked to be geared towards producing puppets, from what Tenten could see. A doorway to the left led to a kitchen. Sasori stepped up behind Tenten as she took in his home. "I may have scored my Hitaiate and left my home for a time, but Sunagakure has never left my heart. I hope to return there one day, when Gaara and the butchers of the Sabako family are gone," he told her. When Tenten turned to look at her new patron in surprise, she caught a wistful look in his dark eyes for a moment before they focused on her. "Now, let's see what can be done to make you more than you are now, shall we say?" Moving over to a finely crafted desk of pale wood, Sasori opened a drawer and removed a small slip of paper that had a faintly iridescent sheen to it with the light of the room's lamps played over it. Tenten's breath caught as he extended it to her. "Take it," he said. "Are you sure?" Tenten asked quietly. She'd seen chakra paper before. Konohagakure produced almost all of the chakra paper used in the elemental nations, and she knew what it did, but a single piece cost more than she made in 6 months even as a jounin, so unlike some of the clan heirs, Tenten had gone to the academy with she'd never been able to afford it, and had focused on disciplines like kenjutsu and fuinjutsu that could be performed without knowing or training one's elemental chakra. "I'm sure. I'd like to see what you're best capable of learning," Sasori said. Nodding, Tenten took the small square of paper from him and held it between 2 fingers. Swallowing, she channeled her chakra through it. She knew that some ninja, especially those without a family history in the shinobi arts, had no elemental affinity, and channeling through the paper simply turned it into an ordinary bit of scrap. Tenten prayed that wouldn't happen to Sasori's expensive gift. Her worry was dispelled in an instant when the piece of paper crumbled to dust seconds after her chakra hit it. "My natural affinity is Earth-type chakra," Tenten thought. She was glad she hadn't tried to buy chakra paper on her own. Konohagakure had few shinobi skilled in earth ninjutsu, and she couldn't afford instruction from any of them. Most Doton masters were in Iwagakure. Sasori smiled at the result. "Good. I thought that would be your affinity. Metalworking is in your blood, and your comfort with tools and weapons of steel is part of your bond to the earth. You can teach me to use earth-type techniques?" Tenten asked. "I cannot. If you had an affinity for wind, there is much I could show you, but earth chakra is not one of my areas of expertise." Noting Tenten's crestfallen expression, he shook his head. "However, you are standing in the presence of the Akatsuki's foremost expert on Doton techniques, from whom you can learn a great deal, I think." "Oh, no fucking way," Deidara growled, stepping up from behind Tenten to glare at Sasori. "Sasori, you think I have time to teach this bun-headed piece of fluff how to mold chakra? I've got better things to do." Anger boiled up inside her at the casual insult. "Insulted my hair? Check. Insulted my gender? Check. Insulted my skill as a ninja? Check. Folks, we have a winner." Tenten had spent half of her life facing derision like that from men who dismissed her as soon as they saw her. Oh, most of them didn't really see themselves as sexist, but they never really respected kunoichi as equals. They might be grateful for the skill of a female medical ninja, but as a competent fighter? Generally, a kunoichi only got respect from men if she was significantly older or higher in rank. Tenten had spent her career being looked down on, and she'd also spent the last 4 years earning respect from men with the same chauvinistic attitude as Deidara. She wasn't going to start a physical confrontation with him. In an enclosed space, his explosives would be impossible to dodge effectively. But she couldn't let the insult lie either. He'd never respect her if she took that from him. Tenten's reply was every bit as caustic as his statement had been. I molded chakra well enough to make you look like a fool, Blondie. Deidara whirled around to face her, his visible eye wide with anger, a tic forming on his forehead. What did you say to me, Leaf Girl? I got the better of you in Sunigakure, so talking down to me just makes you look like even more of a joke than your hairstyle. Two can play that game, pretty boy, Tenten thought with satisfaction as his face started turning red. No guy just rolls out of bed with hair like that. You probably use more product than Ino. He sputtered, and his hand dipped into the pouch of clay at his waist. Not in my apartment, Deidara, Sasori warned, and the blonde Nukenin hesitated. That's all you've got, isn't it? Tenten observed with derision as she glanced at his pouch of clay, a plan forming in her mind. You're a one-trick pony like every other shinobi out there with a Kekii Genkai. Don't insult my art, Leaf Girl. It's not healthy, There was warning in Deidara's tone, his face deadly intent. You're cocky for someone who spent the last week in a cell, Tenten snorted. Sasori-sensei caught me, not you, she retorted, and he can kill me 3 ways just that I know of, puppets, poison and fuinjutsu. That got a faint nod from the San Nukenin. You? I bet you couldn't take a genin without those explosives of yours. They're all you've got, aren't they? A kunai appeared in Deidara's hand in a flash. I don't need my Shunshin no Gaijutsu, art of a single moment, to deal with an upstart like you, he sneered. His throw was as fast as his draw, sending the kunai flying at Tenten. Deidara's speed was impressive, but Tenten had trained for years to react to attacks that moved faster than her eyes could track. Keeping up with Niji and Rock Lee had made that a necessity. Her hand flew up and caught the kunai by the handle inches from her chest. Unimpeded, it would have pierced a lung. Tenten examined it curiously, then shrugged and slipped it into her pouch. Prove it, Blondie, put your time where your mouth is, Tenten said. Spar with me without your clay toys. If I win, teach me some Doton techniques. Tenten saw an amused look on Sasori's face for a moment before it disappeared behind his usual calm expression. Deidara may have been a short-tempered misogynist, but he wasn't stupid. He recognized the trap he'd walked into. If he refused the challenge after talking down to her, he'd look weak in front of Sasori, whose good opinion seemed to matter to him. All right, Leaf Girl, he said with a malevolent smile. We'll fight blade to blade and I'll cut you up well enough, She nodded, but he wasn't done. Since we're naming forfeits, I'll teach you if you win. But when I win, and after they're done patching you up, you'll apologize for your attitude on your back, His eyes traced up and down her body with a leer. You really don't have anything else to offer, I think. Tenten pushed down her anger at his insults and crude demand. He'd reversed her trap on her. If she objected, she'd validate his opinion of her, but if he turned out to have more going for him than just the clay, she could end up in an uncomfortable position. In more ways than one, she thought grimly. Sasori's neutral expression seemed to say, you're a big girl and you started this, you solve it. You're a pig, Tenten stated flatly. And you don't know your place, Deidara shot back, grinning as he sensed an advantage in her discomfort. I sense some hesitation, Leaf Girl. Are you all talk? Tenten's eyes narrowed and her hand blurred as she threw a kunai at Deidara in return. He stopped it just short of his groin, the teeth of the mouth in his hand latched onto the hilt before he grabbed it and twisted it around a finger with a crooked grin. Was that a yes? Let's go, Tenten growled. Not in my apartment, Sasori repeated. Let's go find a sparring room. Shaking his head, Sasori led them out of his apartment and deeper into the complex, to a large room with weapon racks and sparring equipment on the walls and a large clear space for sparring. As they set up in the ring, Tenten assessed the situation. He can't use his clay, but that means that whatever traditional ninjutsu he has is something I haven't seen him use before. Sasori says he's a master of earth techniques, so I have to be on the lookout for those. Without her main summoning scroll, lost in the desert outside Sunigakure, she couldn't perform the Sogu, Tensasai, Heavenly Chain of Destruction, but she had some of the smaller scrolls used in the Sashoryu, Twin Rising Dragons. Tenten started out with a kunai in her right hand, and Deidara followed suit with a mocking smile. "Begin," Sasori said without fanfare once they were ready. Tenten threw her kunai at Deidara, following it with a brace of shuriken. Doton, Doriuso, falling earth spears. Deidara crouched and drove his kunai into the ground. A half-ring of stone spikes shot from the ground, deflecting her weapons. Tenten felt his chakra moving through the ground towards her, and leapt into the air as more stone spikes erupted from the ground she had been standing on. Flipping in midair, she directed chakra to her feet, standing upside down on the ceiling and unsealing a barrage of spiked metal balls, shaping the chakra that accompanied their release from the scroll to send them flying in multiple directions, some directly at him, others bouncing off of walls to hurtle at him from the sides and back. The spheres approached him from all directions before exploding in tandem as the timed explosive tags inside went off, raining deadly shrapnel on Deidara from all directions. When the smoke faded, a dome of rock studded with jagged pieces of metal from the spike bombs stood where Deidara had been. "Fine, you want to fight like a rock ninja? I've fought rock ninja." Tenten tossed out a number of kunai with explosive tags on them attached to rings on her fingers, and they embedded themselves in the walls, floor, and ceiling around the room. Closing her eyes, Tenten focused on the physical and chakra vibrations in the wires. When Tenten felt Deidara's chakra signature moving through the stone, she waited until it was close to one of her kunai, then tugged on the wire, detonating it. She smiled when his chakra presence darted off in a different direction. She tossed more tagged and wired kunai at the area and waited. Moving one's body through dirt, sand or rock was a common skill of Doton masters, but it had a drawback: there wasn't any air for them to breathe while performing the techniques, so they had to surface from under the earth eventually. Hiding from a girl, Blondie? Whatever will the boys' club think? Tenten taunted. Her sense of Deidara's chakra faded as he moved deeper into the stone, and Tenten frowned. She'd been holding her breath since he went under, trying to gauge how long he had, and it wasn't much time left. She waited, concentrating on catching any hint of where he was going to emerge from the rock. Tenten was focusing on the wires, so it took her a moment to notice a chakra spike directly under her feet in the ceiling she was standing on. "The one place I don't have a kunai, and where channeling my own chakra to grip the ceiling interferes with my senses." Even as Tenten cut off the chakra flow to the soles of her feet, arms of stone flowed from the ceiling and grabbed her ankles, reversing the momentum of her fall and slamming her back up into the stone ceiling, hard. As her body dropped again in the stone grip, Tenten felt Deidara himself drop out of the ceiling behind her. She turned her head in time to see a foot heading for her, and then his kick connected with the side of her head with vicious force. Head ringing, Tenten curled into a ball before he could hit her again. She quickly drew a pair of kunai, charged them with her own chakra, and pounded them into the stone arms holding her legs. The stone limbs crumbled and broke, freeing Tenten to drop to the floor. Tenten tugged on some of her wired kunai near where Deidara was about to land, forcing him to dodge the blasts instead of attacking her again as she dropped to the floor and took a moment to shake her head, trying to clear the dizziness. "I'll give you this leaf, girl, you're tougher than you look," Deidara commented. Tenten unsealed a kusarigama from a scroll, gripping the left sickle in her hand while whirling the right in a blurring circle. "If getting kicked in the head was enough to put me down, I wouldn't have survived my genin team, Blondie. You'll have to do better than that." Wordlessly, Deidara leapt at her, katana flashing as he executed a midair slice that forced Tenten to retreat before hurling the right sickle of the kusarigama at him. He dodged it, but Tenten yanked hard on the chain, reversing its momentum. Deidara saw the chain's change of direction and shifted to the side, but the tip of the sickle blade still sliced through his robe and nicked his arm. He responded with a series of blurring sword strikes, forcing Tenten to take both sickles in hand to deflect his blows, returning a few ripostes of her own to keep him on his toes. They went back and forth for a while before Tenten was able to loop the chain of the kusarigama around the blade of his sword, force it out of position and close past the range of his blade. Tenten grinned, then head-butted him, forcing him to lower his hitayate to take the blow from hers. He got his hand down to block the knee she aimed at his groin, but was unprepared when she immediately reversed direction and stomped her foot down on his, hard. She felt something in his foot break under her heel, and his pained grunt made her day. She got in an elbow to his ribs as well before he lowered his shoulder and slammed into her chest, forcing her backward. She tightened the chain of the kusarigama around his katana's blade and tore it from his hands as she stepped back, off balance. Before Tenten could get back on firm footing, Deidara lunged forward and grabbed her wrists, tackling her down to the ground and smashing her wrists onto the floor hard enough that she lost her grip on her kusarigama. Then he was on top of her, and he drew a kunai from his sleeve, the blade plunging down towards her neck. Tenten caught his wrist in a forearm block to arrest the blade's forward progress. He had the advantage of gravity and a male's upper body strength, and he pressed down with both hands until she could feel the tip nick her skin. "I win, Leaf Girl. Look down," Tenten said quietly. He did so and blinked at the kunai in her offhand, the tip hovering between two ribs over his heart. "In this scenario, we both lose," Tenten told him. Deidara shook his head. "Just you, Leaf Girl." He tossed aside the kunai at her neck and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly to him, heedless of the kunai sinking into his chest. Tenten watched with shock as the color faded from his features, turning the same brown as the stone around them. "Crap, an earth clone." Tenten tried to wriggle free of the clone, but it half melted around her, pinning her arms and melding with the floor. Then she felt a katana blade pressed against her neck, and looked up to see the real Deidara standing over her. "I don't think you can get out of this, but if you can feel free to surprise me, he observed clinically. Tenten just grinned at him. Deidara blinked and then staggered back a step as his vision doubled and started to blur. When his blade lifted from her neck, Tenten managed to perform a substitution jutsu with one of the punching bags leaning against the wall on the far side of the room. "You've got some stamina if that isn't affecting you until now," Tenten observed. Deidara squinted at her before looking at his hand in confusion, his eyes struggling to focus. Tenten imagined it was starting to tingle. "How did you dash?" he started to say before biting off the question, and she could see he was disoriented. The poison was slow at first and worked best when exertion sent it through the body faster, but once it started taking effect, temporary blindness came rapidly. "Contact poison on the kunai I threw at you in Sasori's apartment," Tenten replied casually. "Developing immunity to that was not fun, but as you can see, or not see, its effects are pretty useful." "Want the antidote?" "All it takes is 3 little words, you win, Tenten," she said mockingly. Deidara gave up on his deteriorating vision and closed his eyes, shaking his head. "Don't need to see you to beat you, Leaf Girl." "Dotun, Dorioha," he yelled, slapping his palm down on the ground. From the corner of her eye, Tenten saw Sasori shake his head before disappearing in a puff of smoke. A rolling wave of earth exploded outward in a ring from Deidara, cresting as high as the ceiling and bearing down on her in an inescapable wave. Tenten was cut off from the room's only door. "Great," she muttered, grabbing one of her emergency scrolls from her pouch, hurriedly unsealing the defensive tool that was inside as the roaring wall of stone bore down on her. Darkness surrounded Tenten as the metal dome of the iron protection wall popped into existence around her, shaking as Deidara's rockwave hit and washed over it. Crouching under the dome, Tenten winced as the metal groaned and shook. "Got to learn how to do that," Tenten muttered. "After I kick his ass," she amended. Safe but blind inside the metal dome, Tenten listened and tried to sense his chakra, but in the wake of the jutsu his chakra was everywhere, and the rumbling made it hard to hear. She could tell by the groaning of the metal that there was a lot of rock on top of it, and returning it to its scroll would probably crush her. Without warning, the ground shifted. Kunai in hand, Tenten tried to locate the threat before realizing that the stone under her feet had softened, and she was slowly sinking into it. Swearing, Tenten adhered her palms to the roof of the dome and tried to pull her feet free, but hands closed around her submerged ankles and pulled hard, dragging her knee-deep in the liquid rock. Tenten faintly sensed Deidara's chakra presence behind her and threw an elbow back that smashed into his nose, but despite his pained grunt he grabbed her arms and pulled her off balance, dragging her down into the ground. Without leverage she couldn't stop him from dragging her arms underground as well. An instant later the rock returned to its natural state, and Tenten groaned in dismay as she found she was trapped lying on her back with her hands and feet trapped in solid stone with no give to it whatsoever. Deidara surfaced again a moment later, though she couldn't see him in the darkness. "Now that I know you're not getting out of, but just to be sure." Tenten felt a blade pressed against her neck again. "Sasori tells me you may know how to open inner gates. I wouldn't advise trying it. Your dome can't take much more punishment, and without it the rock above will crush you." Listening to the metal above her head creak and groan, Tenten was inclined to agree. "Not sleeping with you," she countered stubbornly. No, of course not, Deidara replied calmly, and Tenten was struck by the change in his tone. If you turned out to be all talk, you'd be doing my laundry or something like that, but I don't coerce women into my bed, as Sasori well knows. Tenten blinked. It was a test, then? Yes. You passed, by the way. It's been a while since someone managed to poison me. It won't be a waste of my time to teach you. He paused. I assume you carry the antidote to whatever you gave me? Under my sash on the right side, it's the vial with a rounded cork. Just drink it, she told him. His nimble fingers found the vial and took it. A moment later his hands were on her arms and legs, drawing them out of the rock. Once freed, Tenten summoned a glowing ball of chakra in her hand. Deidara's face was a bit bloodied from the elbow to the face, and his eyes were unfocused as the antidote did its work, but he made some hand signs and pressed his palms to the ground, pouring chakra into the rock. Tenten could hear stone moving outside the dome. After a few minutes he looked up, his eyes focusing again. You can get rid of the dome. The rock is gone. Tenten returned the dome to its scroll, and her jaw dropped as she looked around. Other than some weapon racks lying on the floor, the room looked as it had when they entered. The remnants of the earth jutsus he'd used were gone. Deidara smiled at the look on her face. Tearing up the earth is easy. Restoring it to the way it was found? That's an art. If you're able, you'll learn to do both. Tenten looked at that smile on Deidara's face and felt something flutter in her stomach. It was the first time she'd seen his smile reach his eyes, and it surprised her that he hid it under his casual air of malice. Deidara took Tenten's hand and helped her to her feet. Sasori rejoined them, looking around with interest. I left when you decided to rearrange the whole room. How did it go? She has some skill, Deidara admitted with a playful grin. I'll see what I can do. Once Deidara let his good humor through, it was infectious, and Tenten's expression brightened in turn. A chance to learn her elemental chakra from a master? More than she'd dreamed possible. Day 1 of the Chunin exams. Amaya, Keed, and Ken got up early and prepared themselves for the Chunin exams. They stopped by Tenten's room before leaving, but when their knocks went unanswered, they decided to depart without her. They made their way across town easily enough, and reached the large structure where the exam was to take place. They saw a number of other genin teams on the way. When they entered the open square in front of the testing building, Amaya heard a familiar voice. What are you babies doing here? Come to watch me win the exam? Suppressing a vicious grin, Amaya turned to face Konohamaru. Moegi and Udon were trailing behind him as usual. Sorry, honored grandson, Amaya replied, watching him grind his teeth at the hated honorific, but we're here to compete. Konohamaru snorted in disbelief. That's a good one, Uchiha brat, except your sensei didn't enter you. With an expression of amused superiority, Konohamaru glanced at Ken, who was bristling at the older genin's tone. Sorry Ken, but only one of us can be Hokage, and it's going to be me. Amaya and Ken were both about to retort when Keed spoke up. Look around you, Sarutobi. A number of foreign genin teams were glancing at the confrontation, their eyes focusing on Konohamaru. You see all those genin from other villages? They've all been training to face the grandson of the third Hokage in this exam, because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about how important you are. Keed crossed her arms. Our sensei did enter us, and we did what ninja are supposed to do, we employed misdirection. Keed was looking right at Udon with those dark shades, and the brown-haired boy swallowed hard. No one will see us coming. You three, on the other hand? You're screwed, Konohamaru. Have fun. Moegi and Udon were looking a little uncertain, registering all the foreign genin looking at them, while Konohamaru was sputtering with wordless rage. Shall we go? Keed asked her teammates, strolling towards the testing hall. Ken and Amaya both laughed and followed along, leaving Konohamaru behind before he could come up with a retort. Inside the testing hall's main atrium were a half-ring of banners depicting village logos and numbers. Some had adult Cloud Ninja standing under them, others didn't. As they watched, a team from Sunagakure approached one of that village's banners, and was led away by the Cloud Ninja who had been standing under it. The banner with Kanahagakure's logo and the kanji 44 had an attendant, who watched Amaya, Keed, and Ken as they approached. You are Kanahagakure's Team 4, the Cloud Ninja asked, a bulky man with dark skin and a shaven head. We are, Amaya affirmed. Follow me to your exam site, then, he instructed them before turning and leading them down a hall. The three genin followed their guide through twisting hallways and down a few levels. When they turned the next corner, there was a pair of Cloud Ninja in ANBU masks blocking the hallway. Their guide stopped short in surprise. Is there a problem? He inquired of his colleagues. If those genin behind you are the students of Tenten of Kanahagakure, then yes, there is, the ANBU with the goat's mask answered. Tenten is our sensei, Amaya answered. What's going on? Goat looked down at the Uchiha girl. You three need to come with us, Goat said flatly, turning to lead them away. Amaya exchanged a glance with Keed. We're not going anywhere until you tell us what's going on, Amaya said. Goat stopped, looked over his shoulder. Your sensei committed a very serious crime against Kumogakure. If you'd like to see her before her sentence is carried out, come with us. It's unlikely you'll get another chance to see her. Dread congealed like a lump of ice in Amaya's gut. That can't be true. She began. The truth of the statement is irrelevant. Regardless of what Tenten sensei is accused of, she is part of the Hokage's entourage and cannot be tried without his knowledge. Your Hokage is aware of your teacher's crimes and has washed his hands of her, Eagle interrupted. If you want to see her, come with us. Ken stepped up behind Keed and Amaya. These accusations against our sensei cannot be true, but we should still visit her, he said quietly, tightly controlled anger in his voice. As Amaya's shock faded, she could see the wisdom of that. They could find out for themselves what was going on better if they went to see their sensei together. Goat and Eagle kept walking, and Amaya, Keed, and Ken followed them, worried and wary. Their exam guide followed, looking worried. They were lead deeper into the building, and Amaya had her Sharingan active and spinning now, mapping their route if they needed to retrace it with a rescue party. In a dimly lit underground hallway, the Cloud ANBU stopped, opened a door, and went inside. When the genin followed them in, they found themselves in one half of an interrogation room. A large one-way window filled the far wall, and through it they could see the other half of the interrogation room. With dismay, Amaya saw their sensei on the other side of the glass. She was tied to the chair at wrist and ankle with chakra rope, and her face was bruised, one eye swollen almost shut. Her white shirt was stained with dried blood in a few places, evidence of minor wounds. A pair of Cloud ANBU was in the room with her, looming over Tenten and talking with her. They couldn't hear the words through the thick window. What is the meaning of this? What have you done to our sensei? Amaya demanded as Ken and Keed stared in horror. Settle down. Most of her wounds are from her fighting when we arrested her, Goat said with disdain. He took a scroll from his belt and dropped it on the table. Amaya could see it was a jutsu scroll, sealed with the emblem of Kumogakure. Your sensei had that in her possession when she was arrested. It was stolen from our ninja library. As the genin watched, one of the ANBU with Tenten rounded the table and punched her in the face hard enough to tip over the chair she was tied to. Tenten's head hit the floor hard and she lay there until they picked the chair back up. Amaya glared at Goat. I said most of her wounds, he said with a shrug. We're trying to convince her to tell us who hired her. It would go easier on her if she did, but she's refused to talk. One of the ANBU hit Tenten again, in the gut this time. Amaya's mind was spinning. Could it be true? Tenten would never steal for herself, it went against her nindo, but what if she had been given a mission to steal the scroll? It would make sense to do it during the Chunin exams when Kumogakure was full of foreign shinobi. A chill went through Amaya as she realized that the most likely scenario was that the Hokage had given her a mission to steal the scroll, either for himself or a third-party client. Tenten would never admit that, or course, even if they threatened to execute her. Why are we here? Keed asked, and Amaya's head came up. She'd been so worried about their sensei that she hadn't even asked herself that yet. I do not believe you have invited us here out of sympathy for us or our sensei. Eagle chuckled. You're one of those ice-cold Aburame, aren't you, girl? Yeah, you're here because we thought you might want to cut a deal to save your sensei. Otherwise, she'll be executed at dusk. What is it you want? Keed asked neutrally. If you three drop out of the Chunin exam, we'll let your sensei live. She'll be flogged for the theft and then you can take her home. Goat said with a shrug. Personally, I'd let her die before I'd lose my chance at Chunin, but I hear you Leaf Ninja are more attached to your teachers, so Eagle here said we should offer you a chance to save her life. Then Amaya understood, and disgust welled up in her. Eliminate foreign ninja from the exam before they can embarrass your village's Chunin, is that it? Goat looked innocent. I may have a nephew in the exams this year, but that's beside the point as far as you're concerned. Forfeit the exam and save your sensei, or go take the exam and you can attend her execution tonight. Keed approached the exam guide, who was standing by the door to the room. You don't care that they're interfering with the exam? I thought you were a proctor. The bald ninja shrugged. I didn't hear anything, he said in an amused tone. I see, Keed said with disappointment. Because Amaya had her Sharingan active, she saw a few of Keed's Kakai bugs slip under the door, but she couldn't fathom what her teammate hoped to achieve. Is that a no? Goat asked. Because if so, you three have a test to take and we have an execution to plan. He stepped over to the window and rapped on the glass. The ANBU in the other room dragged Tenten to her feet, and when they said something to her, fear crossed her formerly stoic expression, and it tore at Amaya's heart. Tenten had protected them ever since they were assigned to her. It's our turn to protect her, even if it does mean 2 more years as Chunin, Amaya thought, and saw the same decision on Ken's face. He nodded to her. Wait. Amaya said, and Goat looked at her curiously. We will forfeit, she had been about to say, but Keed cut her off. We will not forfeit, the Aburame girl stated crisply. Go ahead and kill her. In fact, I'll help. Amaya and Ken turned to stare at Keed in absolute shock, unable to believe she would condemn their teacher. Then Amaya heard Goat say, "What the hell?" Turning back to the interrogation room, Amaya saw Tenten's body shaking as she struggled against the ropes, and her Sharingan caught Kakai bugs crawling on their sensei. Keed, what are you doing? Ken yelled with disbelief on his face as more Kakai bugs slipped under the door of the interrogation room and began attacking Tenten, who was helpless to defend herself. We will not forfeit because that is not our sensei, Keed answered calmly. Then the exam proctor spoke up. Call off your bugs, kid. Kanahagakure's Team 4 passes the exam's first round. Goat rapped on the glass again, and in the other room Tenten vanished in a cloud of smoke. Replaced by a cloud ninja covered in bug bites, shrugging out of the ropes and looking irritated as the Kakai bugs withdrew. Amaya saw Ken's jaw drop, and didn't feel much less surprise herself. How did you know it was a setup? She asked her Aburame teammate. Keed shrugged. I didn't at first. When I realized that Sensei's tracking bug wasn't nearby, the possibility occurred to me. After that, it was a matter of getting more bugs into that room to verify that the person we were seeing was or was not our sensei. Keed paused. Did you believe I would truly condemn Tenten sensei to death? Amaya thought about it. I don't think either of us believed you would do that. It's why we were too shocked to stop you, fortunately for us. Ken nodded in agreement. I'm glad you figured it out, Amaya said honestly. We would have fallen for it without you. Tenten had only been leaning against the wall under the Kanahagakure Team 4 banner and waiting for her Chunin for a few minutes when she heard familiar shouts, and the trio emerged from a hallway and dashed across the room to her. How did you do? Tenten asked them, keeping her voice and expression smooth. She'd been worrying about her students ever since Goat and Eagle had shown up at her hotel room to sequester her until the interrogation room test was complete. She'd been escorted to a room on the other side of town under watchful ANBU eyes to prevent her from interfering while her Chunin were led to believe they were about to be executed and then offered a chance to save her by forfeiting. Tenten had known Amaya and Keed were smart enough to deal with most of the mind games-oriented tests that cropped up in the first round of the Chunin exams, but the interrogation room played to the greatest weakness of Chunin like hers, attachment to their sensei. No village had done the interrogation room in 5 years since the disaster in Kirigakure, so Tenten hadn't expected it to be attempted again in Kumogakure. We passed, Keed answered quickly. Tenten exhaled in relief, sweeping up all 3 of them into a fierce hug. Congratulations, Sensei, not in front of the other Chunin. Ken complained. Laughing, Tenten let go. We passed because Keed figured it out, Amaya added with brutal honesty. Ken and I almost fell for it. Looking around to make sure there was no one nearby, Tenten crouched to be at eye level with her students. I'm glad you passed, she said, and I'm glad you came close to failing. Ken and Amaya looked thunderstruck, while Keed nodded thoughtfully. The interrogation room test can be passed two ways, Tenten explained. 1. The genin team figures out the test. 2. The genin team abandons their sensei. In the eyes of the villages, those outcomes signify that the genin are either perceptive enough or independent enough to be Chunin. Personally, I think the second one's kind of cold. Amaya and Kan's faces brightened, and Tenten tousled Kan's red hair. So, the genin team fails the test if they give in to the coercion? Keed asked. Yes, or if they pick a fight with the participating ANBU, Tenten said. Then she gave them a humorless smile. The interrogation room test actually has a third pass condition: fight the 5 Jonin in the room and win. No one had ever met that condition before the exam in Kirigakure 5 years ago. All 3 genin exchanged wide-eyed looks. That Chunin exam was famous for having included 2 Jinchuriki genin. The final rounds were still talked about. What happened? Ken asked. Namake's Naruto and Sabaka no Gara killed the Jonin testing them, losing control of their bijou in the process, and then proceeded to reduce most of the island the exam was being held on to rubble. They actually had to move the second and third rounds. Tenten tilted her head with a smile. But enough of the history lesson, you passed the first round, and it looks like the proctor has your reward for you. The 3 genin turned to see the bald exam guide walk up with a box of pale wood with a fuinjutsu seal holding it closed in his hands. He presented it to Keed. Your team must report to the exam pavilion outside of the west gate of the village at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to participate in the second round of the exam, and you must have this box with you. Don't lose it or try to open it. With that he departed. Chapter 7, Primary Target. Tenten among the Akatsuki, Month 3. The capital of the land of tea, situated on a nexus of trade routes that stretched out through the elemental nations, was a city of wealth and commerce. The land of tea lacked the military strength of its larger and more populous neighbors, but money was a power all its own, and that power practically oozed from the capital. Its capital was a city that never slept, and even at night the streets were lit and thronging with activity into the wee hours of morning. All the nighttime hustle and bustle and lights made the jobs of shinobi somewhat harder, Tenten reflected as she hid in the shadows cast by the elaborate ornamental rooftop she was currently occupying. Glancing around a fierce-looking dragon carved from wood and painted gold and red, Tenten spied on another inconvenience in the form of an armored figure standing on the next roof over. Since the merchant princes and nobles of the land of tea preferred not to have to sleep in fear of ninja assassins hired by their equally wealthy rivals, the city's council had taken steps to make the city unattractive to shinobi. The brightly lit streets and rooftops at night were a small inconvenience. The garrison full of veteran samurai that policed the land of tea's capital was a far more dangerous impediment. The land of tea was closely allied with the land of iron, home of the samurai, and some of their wealth went towards a permanent force of samurai who upheld the law in the capital. Ninja weren't barred from entering the capital. Many, like the Akamichi or Hyuga, were nobles or merchants themselves, but those who did so legally had to identify themselves upon entry and were placed under constant scrutiny while inside the city walls. Each village had elite shinobi who could evade detection by samurai, but the city's laws carried heavy penalties for unauthorized ninja activity, and none of the kages relished being barred from the land of tea's banks and trade routes if one of their elite was caught or recognized, so the hidden villages as a rule didn't take contracts in the land of tea's capital. This meant, of course, that someone who needed an enemy assassinated or spied upon in the capital of the land of tea had to contract with Nuknin for the work. Most Nuknin weren't good enough to evade detection by the samurai police, but the Akatsuki weren't most Nuknin, which is why Tenten found herself moving cautiously from rooftop to rooftop with a certain blonde, who quietly groused at the rate of their progress. This is ridiculous. Since when do samurai patrol rooftops? Deidara complained quietly. Probably since they figured out that ninja like rooftops, Tenten replied automatically before peering around the corner again. Okay, he moved on, let's go. She suited action to words, darting out of cover and sprinting on silent feet to the edge of the roof, leaping to the next. From the corner of her eye Tenten could see Deidara keeping pace with her easily, his black and red cloak fluttering in the wind, his bangs pulled back from the left side of his face to reveal the sight scope he wore over his left eye. The intricate lenses of the device moved almost constantly as he scanned their surroundings. Tenten knew from trying it on that in addition to letting him see long distances, the device could also be set to detect movement and heat and amplify low light conditions. Currently it was helping him spot samurai before samurai spotted them. Tenten wore her cloudless black cloak and a skin-tight black cloth mask like Kakashi's over her nose and the lower half of her face. Her hair was in a single tight braid instead of her signature buns, and she'd left her forehead protector behind. She didn't plan to be seen by anyone who would remain among the living tonight, but things didn't always go according to plan, and she couldn't afford to be recognized or described accurately. Everyone she knew back in Kanahagakure probably thought she was dead by now, and Tenten intended for it to stay that way. She ignored the familiar pang of guilt at the thought of her family, teammates, and students mourning her death. Forced to dodge 2 more samurai patrols, Tenten and Deidara reached their destination half an hour later. Hiding on another rooftop, they watched the immense palace across the street. It was surrounded by 2 high walls with guards patrolling the tops, large tracts of open space between the outer and inner walls and between the inner wall and walls of the palace. Each floor of the palace was ringed by walkways patrolled by more guards. "We could have been done with this mission 4 days ago, Deidara reminded her. Tenten shook her head at her impatient sensei. "We also could have been skewered by the samurai manning those giant ballistae on the walls, and we would have been spotted before got within a kilometer of the city. Locating one nobleman in a huge palace takes time, which is difficult when the whole city is up in arms." Deidara shrugged. After a few explosions, people stop looking up. Usually, they're more focused on putting out the fires. After a few explosions, the samurai show up in force and the guy we're here for goes to ground. After a few big explosions, goodbye palace and goodbye target. When she first met Deidara, Tenten wouldn't have detected the playful note in his voice, but now she could pick up when he wasn't being serious, and she punched him in the shoulder with a growl. "No, you are not dropping a C3 on the palace. The target and his bodyguards probably have to die, his servants do not. Stop being a baby and keep an eye out for our ticket inside." Tenten would have been disappointed if any of Deidara's suggestions had been serious, but banter was how he dealt with missions, and despite herself she'd come to enjoy his outlandish comments. Nothing about Deidara had been when Tenten had expected when she first met him. The person he had pretended to be when testing her was a cold, caustic mask that Deidara showed to the world, but when he put that mask away he could be funny, lighthearted and thoughtful. Tenten had never met a man before who could make her laugh the way Deidara did, and she was honored that, as they got to know each other, he let the layers of deception fall away and the true Deidara emerge. Tenten had been surprised by how much humor and humanity remained in a man who had been fighting and killing at a far earlier age than Tenten had. Tenten recalled the planning session with Sasori and Deidara after receiving the mission. "Simple," Deidara said when they were gathered in Sasori's apartment after examining the objective and a map of the land of T's capital. "We'll fly in high altitude under the cover of darkness and we'll drop on the palace roof. It will bypass the samurai army in the city, and we can handle whatever security he's got inside, Tenten shook her head. "That won't work." She glanced expectantly at Sasori, but he only looked puzzled. "The plan is sound," the puppet Nin responded. Tenten blinked. "Wow. I know something you don't?" "You're slipping, Sasori-sensei." She said it lightly, but at his frown she elaborated. "Well, that's not fair. I have inside information in this case." Leaning over the map, she circled 6 towers around the city walls of the capital. "There is a Hyuga with active Byakugan in these towers at all times, scanning out and up for threats. Even with cloud cover, we can't fly high enough to evade their sight." "How do you know this?" Sasori asked, taking a new look at the map. "My boyfriend back in Kanahagakure was a Hyuga, and he told me about it when he was sent to set it up. It's one of the Hyuga clan's most valuable contracts, so he was very thorough, and he will have taken into account flying opponents." Sasori nodded. "I see. So, what alternative do you propose?" Tenten suspected her teacher had half a dozen backup plans, but that wasn't the point. He wanted to know what she would do. "First, we forget about trying to go over the wall, it's pointless. Instead, we just walk through the front gate with a few thousand other people." "That might work for you, but I've got a somewhat recognizable face," Deidara objected. "If these Hyuga can spot a bird 2 kilometers up, they'll spot a henge, Tenten nodded. "They would, but there are methods of disguise that don't involve chakra. When I'm done with you, Sasori won't recognize you. We're both good enough at suppressing our chakra to get past a handful of overworked censors who have to skin thousands of people an hour." Deidara considered that. What about my clay? Its chakra will stand out to a censor, and I can't suppress that, nor does the capital have the right deposits for me to make more inside the walls, Tenten didn't answer, she just took one of her smaller sealing scrolls from her pouch and put it on the table. Right, Deidara acknowledged. Once you're in, then what? Sasori asked. Monitor the palace, find the best dressed servants, then waylay them, take their places, and enter the palace. I'll hunt down the target and Deidara can be ready to fly us out once he's dead. The palace has its own censors, Sasori reminded her. Yes, but they're not Hyuga. I can teach Deidara how to mimic the chakra of his henge's target, and they won't sense either of us until it's too late. Entering the city had been easy her way. With their gear hidden in a few innocuous scrolls in Tenten's pack, they had simply passed as a pair of plain countryfolk on a trip to the big city without a drop of chakra or a single weapon between them. They'd taken ordinary lodgings and done ordinary things. If they appeared to be spending a lot of time in their room while actually scouting out their target's palace and leaving clones behind, it fit since they were posing as newlyweds on honeymoon one, although the matronly innkeeper's private advice on what to do with her handsome husband had turned Tenten's face bright red. But their surveillance had paid off. They'd located a pair of servants who looked useful, and now lay in wait for them on a rooftop near the target's palace. Tenten's victim, a maid in the target's service, would get her access to the inner chambers of the palace, while Deidara's disguise was a young guardsman whose appearance would allow the explosive specialist to mine the palace's barracks and other vital areas with hidden bombs. Tenten had reservations about blowing up the guardhouse, but neutralizing security was fair game for an assassination, and she certainly didn't want those soldiers crawling up her back. Here they come, Deidara said quietly from the edge of the rooftop, looking down into the alley below. Moving beside him, Tenten followed his gaze and saw two familiar people walking down the dim alley towards the palace. The woman was a few years older than Tenten, and wore an embroidered, well-cut kimono that was the uniform of the target's personal servants. The man beside her was roughly the same age. The simple armor he wore and the sword at his side identified him as a palace guard. Tenten nodded to Deidara, and then they both dropped into the alley behind the pair. Tenten's hand chopped into the side of the woman's neck, knocking her out before she was even aware of their presence, and Deidara's kick slammed into the side of the man's head a moment later, silencing him. Each grabbed their target and leapt back up onto the rooftop a moment later. Deidara and Tenten stripped the pair of their outer garments and bound and gagged them securely, hiding them in a well-concealed alcove on the roof. Tenten drew a pair of blue senbon and jabbed one into each neck, the drug on it ensuring the pair would sleep through the night. Tenten applied a pair of paper seals to the unconscious captives, and then Tenten placed her hand on the woman, while Deidara touched the man. A puff of smoke later, the guard and the servant girl were examining each other on the rooftop for a moment before nodding and dropping down into the alleyway, heading for the servants' gate to the palace with the confident manner of people who belonged where they were. The guards waved them through the gate without comment. Once inside the inner wall, they split up. Deidara headed for the barracks, Tenten continuing into the palace. In the home of a more modest size this wouldn't work. Tenten didn't know enough about who she was impersonating. But this palace was large enough that most people knew each other by sight but not by name, and servants were both numerous and invisible. Tenten stuck to less trafficked halls to minimize the chances of running into someone who actually knew the person she was disguised as. Sasori's spies had bribed some of the palace's actual servants to provide maps of the building's innards, for which Tenten was profoundly grateful. She would have been lost without the directions. With them, it didn't take her long to make her way up several floors and to the back of the palace, where its master resided. The chambers of Lord Ayashu, the wealthy nobleman the Akatsuki had been hired to assassinate, lay ahead of Tenten. She had been surprised when Sasori had told her that she and Deidara would be taking the job. Not because she objected to assassination, she'd killed her share of targets as a ninja of Konohagakure, but because she hadn't realized that the Akatsuki did such work. Our clients are a very small and selective list, but we do take on paid S-rank missions from time to time. Insurrection isn't free, and maintaining our war chest is just as important as spying on the hidden villages, Sasori had told her. Looking like she had every right in the world to be there, Tenten made her way down the hall to the Lord's chambers. The eyes of the guards followed her, and she could feel others in the shadows, ninja with solid chakra presences, but no one challenged her. The guards just saw another maid, and the ninja were confident in the knowledge that their senses could pierce an ordinary henge. With her own chakra suppressed and hidden behind the stolen chakra of the maid whose appearance she had stolen, Tenten was allowed to pass. Carefully, she opened the door of Lord Ayeshu's chambers and slipped inside. Most of the rooms were unlit. Tenten ghosted through the dark and headed down a passage in which there was light coming from one of the rooms. Stepping inside, Tenten found herself in a palatial office. The walls to either side were lined with books, scrolls, and mementos. A long, low desk made of a single slab of marble dominated the center of the room. Sitting behind it was a balding man with gray hair and a lined face. He wore rich robes of burgundy silk. Tenten's step faltered as she saw what he was doing. His work on the desk had been set aside as he cradled a baby in his arms, a tender look on a face obviously more accustomed to harsh expressions. That face settled into stony neutrality when he noted Tenten's presence and looked up. "Ah, perfect timing, Yuka. I was just about to call for Mayumi's nurse." "Take her, will you?" Tenten nodded wordlessly, feeling a lump in her throat as she stepped forward, taking the infant in her arms. The baby girl squirmed and fussed for a moment. Tenten rocked the child in her arms for a moment to calm her down. Spotting a crib in a corner of the office, she walked over slowly, waiting until the baby calmed down before setting her down in the bassinet. Mechanically, Tenten's mind was going back over her briefing on the mission with Sasori and Deidara. The adorable infant was Ayeshu Mayumi, the Lord's youngest daughter. Some ninja would use the child against the father. Lord Ayeshu was past his prime, but the man had been a feared samurai in his day. Tenten couldn't bring herself to do that. It went against her nindo, and it was bad enough she was about to orphan the girl this night. Forming the hand signs as subtly as she could, Tenten projected a silence jutsu over the baby's crib. It was a tiny movement, but from the corner of her eye Tenten saw the old samurai's head come up, eyes hard. She saw a glitter of metal as something fell from his sleeve into his hand, and then she was leaning back, catching a compact throwing knife in midair. "Assassin," Lord Ayeshu spat as he rose to his feet, hand on the hilt of the sword at his side. His eyes were as hard as the iron of his native land, but Tenten could see worry in his gaze at the presence of a hired killer so close to his infant daughter. Noting Ayeshu edging to the side, Tenten threw his knife back in his direction, high into his right where it sliced through a bell pull of red silk rope he had been sidling towards. Then she drew the tanto sheathed at the small of her back. Inclining his head in respect, Ayeshu drew his katana with a steely hiss. The man could summon his guards with a shout, but as Tenten had guessed he was reluctant to do so, both because she seemed willing to fight him honorably, and because of his concern for his daughter being caught in a general melee. Aware that she was working against the clock to kill Ayeshu before one of his servants or bodyguards became aware of the threat to his life, Tenten made the first move, springing forward and landing on the marble surface of his desk and hurling a kunai that he dodged before making a sweeping strike at her legs that she jumped over. Twirling in the air, Tenten made a pair of hand SLGNS, calling Doton a Shiniken. Stone fists, then she extended her hands, landing on the desktop on her palms, upside down for a moment. Ayeshu's katana flashed in a reverse strike aimed at severing her arms, but before the blow landed the marble desktop around her hands liquefied and flowed up her arms to the shoulders, coating them in liquid rock. The chakra-infused stone was resilient enough that Ayeshu's katana blade broke on impact. "Hell, that did it," Tenten reflected as she heard shouts coming down the hall. Either the chakra of her ninjutsu or the sound of shattering steel had alerted someone. "Time to finish this." Tenten bunched her arms and threw herself up in the air again, righting herself and landing behind Ayeshu as he whirled and barely drew his wakizashi in time to stop her tanto inches from his neck. Undeterred, Tenten got in closer, delivering a stunning blow from a rock-coated elbow to the old samurai's face. As he staggered back, she grabbed the blade of his wakizashi in her bare but marble-covered hand, and sliced his throat open with her tanto. Blood arced into the air as Tenten leapt back from the arterial spray and Ayeshu collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. Not wasting a moment, Tenten threw an explosive kunai out the open doors to the room's wide balcony, darting after it. A moment later the activated tag timed out and the projectile exploded in a flash of light outside, illuminating that section of the palace grounds. A heartbeat later the palace shook with a much larger explosion, the guard barracks going up in a fiery cloud. In addition to signaling the elimination of the bulk of the palace's defenders, the sudden radiance saved Tenten's life as she caught the glint of light off of steel from the corner of her eye. Tenten dove forward and rolled, whirling to see two black-clad shinobi drop from the next level up and another four dart out onto the balcony from the room she'd just escaped. All six were garbed in black from head to toe, their only visible skin their hands and eyes. The arrivals from above had bladed metal claws gripped in their right hands, while the four from inside had drawn swords in two-handed grips. "Damn you, Kunoichi," one of them grated as they closed in a half-circle around her. "This job was good money, and you've ruined it." Tenten shrugged lightly as she sheathed her tanto and drew a pair of sai. "Should have kept a closer eye on your golden goose in that case, because he's cooked now," she taunted, sparing a quick glance behind her. The balcony was several stories up, and it jutted from the side of the palace overlooking a steep cliff, with nothing nearby to jump to. "Hurry your blonde ass up, Deidara," Tenten thought distantly as the vengeful bodyguards attacked. The claw-wielders hung back and peppered her with shuriken as the swordsman closed in with flat, angry eyes, determined to take her life. Tenten responded by diving into the middle of them, forcing the ranged attackers to risk hitting their compatriots. In close with four swords, she probably would have been killed in seconds without her earth jutsu, but with it she could block sword blows with her arms as well as deflecting blades with her sai. Getting inside their guards, punching, kicking and twisting blades in her sai to weaken or break them, she managed to hold off and bloody her opponents while taking only a few minor wounds herself. She put the tip of a sai through an unwary attacker's eye and improved the odds against her. It was going well until one of the claw wielders joined the melee, tackling her from the side. Tenten drove her sai deep into his back, a fatal wound, but his weight and momentum still drove her to the floor. On the defensive, she saw the last claw wielder throw a grenade at her. She couldn't avoid it, but neither could the other 3-1 ninja attacking her. "Oh, no way," she thought, throwing up her stone-wrapped arms to shield her head and torso as best she could. The thing exploded, but instead of being peppered with shrapnel and fire, Tenten found herself surrounded by a glittering orange powder that coated her and filled the air. "Not good," Tenten concluded, forcing her breath to freeze, unwilling to risk inhaling any of the unknown powder through her cloth mask. Squinting so it wouldn't get in her eyes, she took advantage of the reduced visibility inside the cloud of dust to roll away from the swordsman and out of the cloud, darting to the edge of the balcony. Within seconds she was starting to feel lightheaded, her limbs having the sensation of almost floating. Aware of the powder coating her face, Tenten cursed under her breath. "Figures it works on skin contact too." To her dismay, the swordsman emerged from the cloud seemingly none the worse for the wear. "They're immune to it? Lovely." Tenten wasn't sure what the stuff was supposed to do, but it wasn't paralyzing her, so she raised her guard, counting the seconds. "Come on, Deidara, now would be a good time." He should have made a big bird to get them out of the city and been on his way by now. Oddly, the enemy shinobi didn't seem anxious to close with her again. "Good work," the one who had initially addressed her said to the one that had thrown the grenade. Then he looked at Tenten, and to her surprise pushed back his cowl, revealing the visage of a scarred, gray-haired ninja in his 50s, whose lined face cracked into an unpleasant grin. Tenten's vision swam for a moment, and she staggered as her balance wavered. "What the hell? Can't think straight. No quick death for you, Kunoichi. Though you'll wish you were dead before my nephews are done with you. Drop your weapons." Tenten was startled by the sound of steel hitting wood, and looked down to see a pair of bloodied sai lying on the balcony floor at her feet. "Weapons?" Her head felt like it was wrapped in thick layers of wool, and she took a few steps back. Looking up from the discarded sai to the men, who were sheathing their weapons, looking relaxed, she tilted her head. "Are those mine? Who are you? Who am I?" For a moment Tenten thought her voice sounded like a stranger, and then in the next moment she wasn't sure why that thought has occurred to her. Lost in introspection, she looked around the balcony slowly as the four men closed in on her, the one without a mask smirking. Noticing the body of the other two, she asked, "Was there a fight?" Something like a sense of alarm tried to make itself known in her brain, but dissipated without taking root. "Don't worry yourself about it. Show me your hands," the gray-haired man asked as he drew a coil of rope from his belt. Tenten was almost reduced to tears. Taking charge like that, he was so nice. She obediently held up her arms, watching in fascination as bits of stone clinging to her skin flaked off and fell to the floor. Then her curiosity was diverted to the older shinobi's dexterous fingers binding her wrists. All of Tenten's senses were magnified, so she could see each strand of fiber twisted into the ropes, and the weave of the cloth and the uniforms of the men around her. Her ears picked up the faint sound of wings flapping. Looking up and behind her new friends, Tenten's wide, slightly glazed eyes spotted a handful of beautiful white avians flying down to the balcony from above. Birds! She cooed. One of the men near her laughed, but his amusement was drowned out by much louder wing beats. What the dash, one of them yelled before Tenten was hit by a gust of air from behind. Something wrapped firmly around her waist, and she saw a massive, carefully sculpted pair of alabaster bird talons gripping her. Another wing beat, and she was going up, airborne. Rising rapidly, Tenten squealed with delight. Then the smaller bird she had spotted hit the ninja left behind below. Katsu, a new male voice called above her, and the entire balcony erupted in a dazzling series of explosions. Absorbed by all the interesting things she was seeing this high in the air as the giant bird carrying her flew away from the lovely palace below, enticed by the rush of air on her skin, Tenten didn't know how much time had passed, moments or minutes, before a strong pair of arms grabbed her shoulders and dragged her up on top of the bird. Those same hands shook Tenten's shoulders as she found herself face to face with a handsome man with blonde hair and a black robe with red clouds. His one visible eye was filled with irritation and worry. "Tenten, what the hell happened? You scared me half to death," he chided her. Then he glanced down, grimaced, and guided the bird in a sharp turn as a pair of ballista bolts flew by. Tenten stared at them, counting the fletching in their massive tails until she couldn't see them by the moonlight anymore. Then she looked back at Deidara, trying to remember what his question had been for a moment before giving up. "Good bird," she said, patting the clay she was sitting on. The words came out slightly slurred. The blonde looked at her sharply. "Did they hit you in the head?" He summoned a glowing ball of chakra to his palm, looking more closely at her. Most of the orange powder had been blown away, but when he got close enough to look into her glazed eyes he got a faint whiff of it on her skin, and recoiled. "Damn, those Mikuzuchi clan bastards dosed you with dream dust," shaking his head before looking at her with disbelief. "You're higher than a kite, aren't you?" "Yup." Tenten chirped brightly, leaning over to look down at the darkened landscape the big white bird was flying over. "Much higher than a kite," she added. Her balance wavered for a moment, but Deidara absently hauled her in by her sash before she could fall off. "Great," Deidara muttered, fishing in his robe and pulling out a small book that he started leafing through. "Just count something, okay?" Nodding placidly, Tenten sat next to Deidara and started counting each silky, flaxen hair in the long bangs that covered his left eye. "Let's see here," Deidara muttered, finding the page he was looking for and reading aloud. Dream dust symptoms include memory loss, extreme suggestibility, disorientation, as well as mild euphoria and heightened senses. Repeated exposure can result in immunity to the effects. Antidote? None? Remove affected persons from danger and supervise closely. Effects wear off in 2 to 4 hours depending on dosage and metabolism of recipient. Sighing, he closed the book and put it away. Tenten's count of Deidara's hair kept getting interrupted when the wind would toss the fine blonde strands around. After the third time it happened, she absently reached out to hold them still. Then she gasped at the smooth, silky feel of his hair. "What are you doing?" he asked before blinking as he found her face inches from his. Then she rubbed her cheek against his flowing locks. "So soft," she murmured. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her back. Studying her, she looked back, eyes full of innocent curiosity. "Figures you turn out to be happy and touchy-feely when you're stoned," he observed with resignation. "Think you could sit still until I find a safe place to land?" Tenten only had to think about it for a moment before shaking her head. "Great," he sighed. "Just, don't distract me, he said finally, positioning her behind him on the bird's back. After looking around for a moment, Tenten settled for playing with his ponytail for a little while before starting to braid it. The ropes around her wrists made it a little harder, and it occurred to her to use one of the innumerable bladed weapons on her person to cut herself free, but the thought didn't last long enough to be translated into action. Tenten managed to finish the braid shortly before the giant bird dipped in the sky and descended into the dark trees below. Disengaging himself from her grasp and dropping to the ground, Deidara set about making camp, pausing to cut her hands free of the ropes around her wrists. "It would be nice to have some warm food, but I don't think we can risk a fire." We'll wait until that stuff wears off and then head out. What stuff? Tenten asked brightly. Right. Let's just take a nap, Deidara said, laying out their bedrolls next to each other under by moonlight. Come sit down, he told her, and Tenten obediently curled up on the bedroll. Try to relax, he said, and she did try, but with her senses so amped up, rest proved elusive. In the end she just sat there, studying Deidara, as he lounged next to her watching her warily. What's so fascinating? He inquired after 10 minutes of silence. Tenten pondered that question for a while, before answering absently, you. Having studied his hair to her contentment, she'd moved on to examining the sturdy fabric of his Akatsuki robes, her eyes keen enough to pick out the fine, chakra-laced wires woven into the cloth, giving it both resilience and resistance to jutsus when used as a shield. Then her examination moved on to his face. His visible blue eye was fascinating, and his skin was flawless, even to her enhanced sight. Leaning closer, her hand absently came up to touch him, stopped short when he gently caught her wrist in his hand. The sensation of his calloused fingers on her skin was interesting enough that she paused to study this new development. What are you doing now? He inquired with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. I'm not sure, she said slowly, glancing back at his face, distracted by the movement of his lips when he spoke. A new impulse in her head translated itself into action, avoiding all the usual filters that the narcotic had shut down, and this time she was close enough that Deidara only had time for a moment of wide-eyed shock as she leaned in and her lips met his. His lips were smooth and firm and he tasted faintly of mint. The kiss lasted for only a moment before Deidara recovered and put his hands on her shoulders, pushing her back. Tenten, no, he said firmly. You don't wanna, she asked with a pout before flopping back on her bedroll with a dejected expression. I don't he managed in a half-strangled voice, before shaking his head in bemusement. No, I certainly wanna. Then why not? Tenten inquired, her voice fainter. Deidara leaned back to look at the stars. It wouldn't be fair to you with that dust messing up your head. If you want to pick up where we left off tomorrow, I'm all for it. Besides, Deidara offered after a reflective pause. Sasori, Haydn and Conan would be lining up to skin me if I took advantage of you while you were drugged. When he didn't hear anything from her, Deidara glanced at Tenten, noting her closed eyes and slow breath. You didn't hear any of that, did you? He asked wryly. Well. Lying back on his bedroll, he watched the stars, listening for signs of pursuit. Hours later, in the gray before dawn, Tenten woke with a start, looking around in alarm until she spotted Deidara lounging beside her. Then the grinding pain of a headache made itself known and she groaned quietly, rubbing her temples gingerly with her fingers. What happened? She inquired, memories a muddle. Mission accomplished, at least, I hope so. You gave the signal for target eliminated, Deidara replied, sitting up. Lord Ayesha's blood fountaining from his neck jumped into her consciousness and Tenten nodded jerkily. Yeah, he's dead. His bodyguards chased me and the last thing I remember is some grenade exploding in my face. After that, it's a blank. Tenten's eyes widened in dismay. Did anyone see me? Deidara shook his head. The bodyguards are dead, so no. Plenty of people saw my bird take off, and the samurai took some potshots, but I think everyone who saw you is no longer among the living. Nothing else happened? For some reason Deidara looked slightly nervous. Nope, nothing, just flying here and waiting for the stuff in that grenade to wear off. You were out of it for a little while. Tenten winced. I hope I didn't do anything embarrassing, she said. Deidara coughed and then got to his feet. Hey, look at the time, we should probably get going. Turning away from her, he busied himself forming a giant bird to carry them back to base. Tenten frowned, suspicious of his evasive behavior. Seriously, what happened? Nothing. She was about to dig further to find out what he was hiding when her view of him from behind made her blink. Deidara, since when do you braid your hair? Kumogakure, the Chunin exams. The morning after the end of the first round, Amaya, Kid, Ken and Tenten made their way to the spot outside the gates of Kumogakure where the second phase of the Chunin exam was to begin. It was cold, and Amaya wore long pants, sturdy boots and an overcoat over her Uchiha tunic, while Ken had swapped his usual skin-tight outfit for a thicker and darker green bodysuit under the orange leg warmers. Kid, who dressed warmly year-round, wore thick pants and boots like Amaya's in addition to her omnipresent hooded jacket. There was no audience for this gathering, just a group of exam proctors waiting as the genin teams that had passed the first round assembled. All three Konohagakure teams had passed the initial test, so when they arrived Ebisu and Ganma's genin were already there. Ebisu and Ganma both gave Tenten sour looks, which she responded to with innocent smiles. The older Jounin, whose teams hadn't even attempted to make a secret of their presence at the exams, had been shamed in front of the Hokage and Anko by the ability of a rookie Jounin half their age to keep her team's entry a secret from everyone. Konohamaru's eyes simmered with rage, but Amaya and Kid did an excellent job of pretending the older genin wasn't even there, and Ken was playing along admirably once he saw how much being ignored pissed his rival off. Soft growls from Ganma's team heralded the presence of the Inuzuka triplets. They looked much like Kiba had as a genin, Tenten decided, although they wore their hair longer and in brown dreadlocks that fell over their shoulders. The trio's names were Haruko, Hikaru and Hiroko, although most of the time even their parents couldn't tell them apart. Tenten had warned her genin about the Inuzukas. They're older than you, more experienced, and if you let them get close their clan techniques can kill you. Tenten hadn't been joking about the killing either. Rumors that she had confirmed with Ganma indicated that the triplets went for the kill with an unnerving eagerness. Granted, their clan's techniques were not suited for soft capture like the Aburame, Nara or Yamanaka, but their bloodlust was extreme. If you face any of them in a battle where they can get away with killing you, assume they'll try, had been Tenten's advice to her students. Sealed wooden box in hand, Amaya approached the exam proctor pavilion, where a Kumogakure seal master opened the box and handed Amaya back 3 items, a yellow stone plaque with a thundercloud engraved on it, a folded map, and a tag that had the kanji 412 on it. Find the proctor with that number on his back, and don't lose the plaque or the map, they're important, the white-haired old woman who had removed the seal instructed Amaya, who nodded and slipped the plaque and map into a pocket inside her coat before anyone outside the pavilion could see it. Tenten nodded in approval at the precaution. Tenten's genin found the exam proctor with 12 on his back, who like the rest was gathered around a stage. When Konohamaru's team approached the stage and met the proctor with a 2, Tenten spotted Konohamaru examining a plaque the same size as Amaya's, but carved from blue stone and with a lightning bolt on it. A moment later Ebisu chided Konohamaru and he put it away, but Tenten glanced at Amaya and knew her sharp-eyed student had noticed. All information was valuable. Once all the other genin teams had arrived and found their proctors, a familiar face climbed up onto the stage. Tenten recognized Darui, Jounin commander of Kumogakure, as he faced the audience. There were 13 genin teams left after the first round, 3 from Konohagakure, 2 from Iwagakure, 1 from Sunagakure, 3 from Kirigakure, and 4 from Kumogakure. Congratulations on reaching the second round of the Chunin exams, Darui said, addressing the assembled teams. His voice was monotone, and he had the body language of someone who didn't really want to be there. Jounin instructors will now depart and return to the village. Tenten nodded. It made sense to keep the teachers in the dark about the exam rules, it reduced the temptation to cheat. Tenten bid her students goodbye, then returned to Kumogakure with the other Jounin sensei. Once the Jounin were all gone, Darui addressed the genin. The second round will serve to winnow down the numbers of participants for the final round. No more than half of you will make it through this round. Turning, Darui pointed behind him, where hilly forest cut through with rivers gave way to a mountain range in the distance. The location of the final round is in those mountains. Normally it's a 3-day trip. Once the instructions for the round have been explained, your proctor will take you to one of the starting places on the edge of the forest, and you will have 10 days to reach the testing site. Reaching into his tunic, Darui turned to a large board that formed the back of the stage, and nodded to a proctor, who tugged a cloth sheet off of it, revealing a large map. This is a map of the second round testing area. Each team has a map like this. There are actually 3 different maps that a team could have. One has the cleared trails through the forest and mountains marked on it. Another has the locations of several shelters in the testing area stocked with food, ninja supplies, and warm beds. The third map has the exact location of the entrance to the area where the final round will be held. Darui paused to let that sink in. How does that eliminate half the teams? It would make more sense to share information, Ken observed quietly. He's not done explaining, Amaya answered in a whisper. Turning to a table behind him, Darui picked up 2 stone plaques, one the yellow tablet Amaya had, the other the blue stone Konohamaru was showing off. Finally, these are the Thunder, the yellow one, and Lighting, the blue one, seals. To gain entry into the final round of the exams, a team must possess both seals, intact and undamaged. Each team has one of these seals. To enter the final round, you've got to take the plaque you don't have from another team. Only full teams will be admitted to the final round. Incapacitation or death of one or more team members disqualifies the team. That's how they eliminate half the teams, Amaya said. It's clever, really, Keed reflected. Sharing map data increases the likelihood of reaching the final round, but every team that wants to reach the final round has to take out at least one other team to get the seals they need, so you can't trust anyone very far. With the instructions over, the proctors split up, leading their assigned teams down the valley to the edge of the forest. Amaya, Keed, and Ken quickly lost sight of the other teams. Once they were out of sight, Amaya pulled out their map and examined it as Ken and Keed looked over her shoulder. It looked like the one Darui had demonstrated, but there's had a dozen different supply caches marked on it. Damn, Amaya sighed. I was hoping we'd get the one with trails or testing location on it. Ken shook his head. For us, this is probably the best map, he said, and both girls looked at him in surprise. Their male teammate knew that they were better at thinking on their feet than he was, so he deferred to their judgment in most situations. It was rare for him to contradict either of them. Seeing their gazes, he ducked his head slightly, mumbling, "Are either of you carrying 10 days' worth of food and water?" Keed and Amaya exchanged a glance before shaking their heads. "Can't we just forage? If we were in the land of fire, sure," Ken replied calmly. "But we're on the other side of the elemental nations. I don't know what plants and animals are safe to eat here. Do you?" While the girls mulled that over, Ken pointed down the gully they were descending, and up. "Food isn't the only problem. See those clouds?" Gazing at the horizon, Amaya and Keed could see dark, towering clouds that were gathered above the mountains. In Kanahagakure, I'd call that a nasty thunderstorm about a day away. But this high up in the mountains, that's probably a really nasty blizzard ready to pound the forest we're walking into with snow and wind. Chastened, Amaya and Keed were reminded that in spite of their shinobi survival training, they were both city girls, while Ken had grown up on a farm outside the village walls. Their proctor guide, a dark-skinned man with his hitayate wrapped as a bandana around his head, glanced over his shoulder. "Listen to your friend there," he advised Amaya and Keed. "The weather in this region is as deadly as any ninja you'll face." Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a metal tube with a wooden stock. "The last piece of instruction for this round is this: if you wish to forfeit for any reason, fire this flare into the air. A and BU teams are stationed throughout the testing area, and they will come to retrieve you. If another team fires their flare, you are prohibited from taking any action against them outside of self-defense. Doing so will result in disqualification. Understood?" When all three nodded, the proctor handed Ken the flare gun, and he stowed it in his pack. When they reached the bottom of the gully, the proctor checked the time. "Good, it's almost noon. Once you hear the gong, you are free to begin." That said, he moved away to give them privacy while keeping an eye on them. While they waited, Keed spoke up. "At least 3 other teams will have the same map we do. They are the ones we will be most likely to encounter. We cannot consider the shelters safe." Amaya nodded, pulling out the map again and studying it. "We're the youngest team here, but we're also one of the fastest. It's a pretty good bet no one with a supply map like ours can match our speed, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to head straight for this supply cache here," she said, pointing to one about a half-day's run away. "Take what we need and move on through the night. In the forest we can move quickly, so we should be able to reach this one." She pointed to another shelter further in, a little after midnight. Amaya glanced at Ken. "Do you think we can do that before the storm breaks?" Ken mulled over the distances and nodded. "Yes, if we hurry and don't have to fight." Amaya nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." Keed looked over the map as well. "Hopefully the second shelter is a defensible position. We will be at a disadvantage during the storm. I cannot use the Kikai bugs during an ice storm, so my ability to provide early warning of approaching opponents will be lost." The gong sounded, echoing over the forest, and Amaya folded up the map, stowing it away. "Let's move." The 3 genin blurred as they ran into the forest, taking to the treetops in the fashion of leaf ninja, chakra in the soles of their feet gripping branches and accelerating them towards their destination. With her charges off on their way, it was time for Tenten to get started on her own mission. Hanging back at the gate, she waited for Darui to re-enter the village, and then spent the rest of the day and 2 days after shadowing him discreetly. He spent a lot of time in the Raikage offices, as expected of a Chunin commander. He had a home nearby in the administrative area, and while he frequently went out for the evening or entertained in his home, he was hardly ever alone, surrounded by a posse of other shinobi. In her apartment at the end of the second full day of observation, Tenten wrote in her journal, "This assignment is going to be challenging. He's not married and he doesn't seem to be dating, but he flirts enough with other women that I doubt he's gay. After 2.5 days, I don't see an obvious way to approach him. If he were some random Chunin, I could just put on something revealing and walk past him in a bar, but he's smarter than that, from what I can see. He'd be instantly suspicious of a foreign kunoichi coming on to him. Somehow, I have to get him to come to me, and that means getting creative." Pausing in her writing, Tenten glanced at the flyer that had been delivered to her room that morning. While other villages pretty much left their foreign ninja guests to their own devices, Kumobakure had a long history of arranging friendly contests and tests of skill for the visiting Chunin to take part in while their students took the Chunin exam. She hadn't intended to waste time participating until she saw Darui and several of his friends signing up for the Kenjutsu tournament. It was a competition dominated by Cloud and Mist Shinobi, the two villages that placed the most emphasis on swordsmanship, and Tenten knew none of the other Leaf Chunin would take part in that competition. But if Darui was going to be there, it was a chance to catch his attention in a forum where he wouldn't be on guard as much as a ninja bar or on the streets. So Tenten had signed up herself. "We'll see where this goes. At worst, I get to improve my blade work a bit," Tenten wrote before closing and sealing the journal and heading to bed. Chapter 8, Timetables. Tenten among the Akatsuki, Month 4. Tenten flashed through a trio of hand signs and calling out Doton, Choyakuiwa. Leaping rocks, then she stomped her right foot onto the stone floor of the training room. Meters away, 4 orbs of solid stone shot from the floor and shot straight up. Each ball pierced through 3 bales of hay hanging lengthwise from wires and emerged above them with enough force to impact the ceiling with a loud crack, spider web fractures in the rock evident where they had hit. Behind Tenten her audience clapped a few times, and she turned with a triumphant smile that matched Daidara's. "Excellent, Tenten, very good," he congratulated her. "It was loud, at least," said Sasori from the doorway of the training room under the Akatsuki base, having just arrived. "I assume everything is going well?" The San Nuknin was leaning in the doorway, a look of interest on his face as he took in the shredded hay bales and the dents in the ceiling. "Very well," Daidara replied, addressing Sasori and Tenten. "In fact, I'd say Tenten has learned what she needs to from me." Tenten blinked in surprise, and Sasori raised an eyebrow. "I haven't taught her all the earth ninjutsu I know, that would take years. But she has a solid repertoire now, and she's as skilled with it as any rock Chunin at this point. Further advancement will come from studying ninjutsu scrolls or working on skills of her own." What you just heard was Tenten's first original Doton technique. She created it herself over the last month, and I wouldn't want to be the shinobi who takes one of those to the groin or chin. He pointed at the fist-sized rocks she had summoned to fly vertically from the floor. "I'm impressed," Sasori admitted. "Tenten, your progress in Fuinjutsu has been noteworthy as well given how short a time you've been with us. I wonder if you'll need the whole year to become a full Akatsuki." Tenten flushed at the praise, bowing to both of them. "If I've learned a lot, it's because I've had amazing teachers. As to the trial, I'll think about moving it up when my record against you two is a bit better," she finished wryly. Sasori still managed to beat her in less than 3 minutes, more than half the time they sparred. Daidara hadn't in a few weeks, but he was holding back, and she couldn't fault his reasoning. If Sasori tags you when he's not expecting to, the worst you'll get is a flesh wound or a dose of a poison he carries the antidote for, but if you don't dodge a clay bomb in time, we'll be cleaning up what's left of you with a mop, he'd said earnestly when she confronted him over it. Regardless, until she could last longer against Sasori, she wasn't in a hurry to step into the ring with a full Akatsuki who was actually trying to kill her. Sasori nodded in acknowledgement. "When the two of you are done here, I'd like it if you could join me in my apartment for lunch. We have something to discuss." With that, the red-haired puppet master departed. Tenten used Earth Chakra to smooth the holes she'd made in the floor and ceiling, practicing her jutsu, while Deidara cut down the hay targets and stacked them in the corner for the next person who wanted to practice. As he tossed the last bale onto the stack, Deidara caught a whiff of the floral soap Tenten bathed with when she wasn't in the field, and turned in surprise to find himself face to face with her as she gave him a searching look. "We should go see what Sasori wants, In a moment, first we need to talk," she replied. Quiet alarm bells went off in Deidara's head. In his experience, a woman saying "we need to talk" rarely ended well. Running their last few conversations through his head, he didn't spot any obvious verbal grenades, but that didn't mean they weren't there. "Is this about what I said to Sasori?" Deidara guessed. "I meant what I said, Tenten, you've made amazing progress." She gave him a soft smile and shook her head. "No, it's not about that." Her expression became thoughtful. "It's a funny thing about dream dust. The memories do come back eventually." Deidara winced, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly with one hand. "Oh. About that dash." "I wanted to thank you," she interrupted him. "Thank me for what?" he asked, surprised. Most women he'd known in Iwagakure would have been mad at him just for letting the kiss happen. For not. Sighing, she looked down at the floor. "For not taking advantage when I kissed you, most of them men I've known would have." He placed his hands lightly on the sides of her shoulders, and she looked up. "Hey," he said softly. "That's not something you need to thank me for. Without maligning your old village too much, that says more about the men you grew up around than it does about me, Seeing the doubt linger in her eyes, he pressed on. "Besides, I've been on the other side of that equation." Tenten blinked in surprise. "What do you mean? I assume your village's Jounin exam included sessions on resisting interrogation?" When she nodded, he continued. "Iwagakure does that too, and since the villages we were most likely to fight were San and Leaf, it's heavy on filling you full of drugs and debilitating poisons to get used to being under their influence. I was 15 when I went in for that test." The assistant of the ANBU interrogator who was conducting the test was a kunoichi a few years older than me who'd been chasing after me since we were in the academy. Once they had me on 3 different drugs and I was having trouble remembering my own name, she convinced her boss to let her try something different to get me to give up the code phrase I was supposed to be keeping secret for the test. Tenten winced, guessing where this was going. "You don't have to tell me this, Deidara." He shrugged. "I'm just saying I've been out of my skull and at the mercy of someone who didn't care if I was capable of consenting or not." He concluded calmly. "I wouldn't do that to you, Tenten gave him a brilliant smile. "Thank you." Then she stepped closer, and Deidara's back hit the wall. "I remember everything you said that night, too. No dream dust in my system now." Her fingers rose to rest on his cheeks, and her face drew closer to his, hesitantly. He removed that hesitation, his arms sliding around her waist as he dipped his head, and their lips met, questing at first, then fierce. When the kiss ended, Deidara looked her in the eye. "Are you sure? What about your guy back in Kanahagakure?" Tenten had felt guilty thinking of Niji when she realized she was falling for Deidara, but she shook her head slightly. "Honestly? I doubt I'll ever see him again unless it's across a battlefield. Even if I did go back, distance has given me some perspective. Niji is a great guy, the opposite of all the chauvinists and opportunists that make up the bulk of Kanahagakure's shinobi. But what I felt for him was a mix of youthful infatuation and the lure of a safe harbor. We were genin together, and I was attracted to him for a long time, but I've come to realize it wasn't love, and in any case, our backgrounds were too different. He never would have been permitted to marry me, and we both knew it." Deidara nodded in understanding, and he kissed her again. He had the same faint taste of mint that she remembered, and wrapped in his arms, she felt safe and warm. When their lips parted again, he smiled. "So, you're saying you love me?" Tenten's breath caught in her throat. "I've only known you for a few months, but I think so, yes. I'd like to find out for sure if you feel the same." He nodded. "I think I do, and that sounds like an acceptable exploration to me." They kissed once more, and Deidara felt her nimble fingers leave his face and start working on the catch to his Akatsuki robe. A moment later the heavy fabric slid free from his shoulders and puddled around his feet on the floor. What about lunch, he inquired teasingly, noting that her cheeks were a bit flushed and feeling an undeniable stirring in his own body. Sasori-sensei can wait, Tenten breathed, slipping a hand between the folds of his tunic to run her hand over the muscles of his chest. Fair enough, Deidara concluded. Tenten squeaked in surprise when he picked her up bridal style. Hold your breath. She had enough time to inhale sharply before they sank into the stone floor. In the space of a few heartbeats, they emerged in a different part of the base that Tenten recognized as Deidara's apartment. Where were we? He asked. They reminded each other, at some length. Wandering into the training room at the time he had reserved it for, Hoshikage Kisame's eyebrows rose slightly when he noticed a discarded Akatsuki cloak in the corner near the targets. Curious, he wandered over, crouching by the lost cloak and inhaling deeply through his nose, the 3 slits on each side of his face opening slightly as he did so. Then he blinked before chuckling quietly. Picking up the cloak, he hung it on a hook outside of the training room before closing himself inside. The fish-faced Akatsuki figured if the scents clinging to it were any indication, Deidara wouldn't be back for his cloak anytime soon, and might object to it getting soaked in water. If Sasori noticed that Deidara and Tenten were a bit late for lunch, or that her buns and his ponytail were slightly more mussed than usual, he didn't comment on it. Outsiders to the Akatsuki wouldn't think of them as being decent cooks, but since the organization prized secrecy, they couldn't exactly have servants to tend to them. Their unique skill sets took care of a number of mundane issues. Kisame's prodigious chakra and elemental affinity drew water from the aquifer below into cisterns that fed into the rooms. Garbage was left at communal spots in the base, and twice a week the cheerfully enigmatic masked Akatsuki known as Toby simply looked at the accumulated debris and made it vanish into thin air. Like most members, Sasori cooked in the manner of his homeland, so when they arrived, he had tea and a steaming pot of stew waiting. It was a savory and spicy mix of goat, tomato, peppers and a strain of edible cactus that replaced potatoes as a starch in most dishes from Sunagakure. When the meal was done and cleared away, Sasori got down to the matter at hand. I've suffered a bit of a setback, and I was hoping to share my thoughts with you as to how to proceed, he said, with a glance at Tenten, who looked startled. I'll help however I can, Sasori-sensei, she replied promptly. Good. I've spoken to you before of the difficulty of getting spies into your old village. I have only a handful in place. Orochimaru's paranoia serves him well, unfortunately, as we really are out to get him. I received word today that my most highly placed spy in Konohagakure is dead. Tenten sighed. I'm sorry to hear that. Were they found out by ANBU? Sasori shook his head. The only silver lining in the cloud is that he wasn't uncovered. He was an active duty shinobi and was simply killed during a routine mission for the Hokage that went bad. But regardless of the circumstances, I'm left with a hole in my intelligence network, and I'd like your insights into how best to fill it. Who do you feel we could have the best chance of approaching and convincing to aid us among the ranks of Konohagakure's disaffected? He placed a handful of dossiers on the table. The information you've given me has been invaluable, and I wanted your input. Tenten nodded, feeling a leaden weight in her gut as she glanced over the files of the Leaf Ninja with shaky loyalties that Sasori had selected. After several minutes of silence in which she separated the files into 2 stacks, she shook her head. None of them, she answered finally. Sasori looked at her calmly. Your reasoning? Tenten placed her hand on the first and much larger stack. The one on top was Mizuki, a silver-haired Chunin with his Hitayate worn as a bandana. Any of these ones are more loyal to money than the village. You could buy their services, but I wouldn't pick them. Why not? Most spies work for greed rather than ideology, Sasori countered reasonably. I know, but none of these are trustworthy, and none of them are subtle enough to avoid notice for long even if they don't turn around and sell you out to Orochimaru. You could approach any of these for a one-time information dump, but if you're looking to cultivate a long-term source, none of them can do it. I see. What about those ones? Sasori pointed to the second, smaller stack of files. The one on top had a picture of Yuhi Kurenai, a jounin with wild black hair and red eyes. Tenten felt her throat tighten. These ones might be willing to help us for the same reason I joined. They oppose the policies of the Hokage and may risk everything for a chance to get rid of him if they're convinced it's possible. Then wouldn't those be our best candidates? Sasori asked. Yes, but Orochimaru and his ANBU captains are good at what they do. These people are all most likely under observation, just like I was before you captured me. Approaching them might get us a long-term agent, or it might get some good people killed. Tenten was startled when Sasori gently put a hand on hers. I understand, Tenten. You don't want to endanger these people. I don't either, but we need embedded agents in the villages if we're to have any hope of freeing them from the Kages. You know that. Tenten nodded dejectedly, before an idea occurred to her that was so simple, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it as soon as Sasori made the problem clear. You want a spy who's an active duty leaf shinobi, right? Sasori nodded. Why not skip the initial contact and recruitment and use someone we already have? Deidara, who had remained silent through the exchange, figured it out first. Tenten, no. Sasori considered it. It's an interesting idea, Tenten, but we don't have any Akatsuki members to spare for something like that, and even if we did, getting a shinobi who's an outsider into Kanahagakure's ranks is next to impossible. Seeing Deidara about to object, Tenten plowed forward. Send me back to Kanahagakure. I can be your spy. Sasori looked at Tenten with surprise, then at Deidara, whose expression was mutinous. I'm not certain that's feasible either, Sasori said carefully. A few months ago, we could have contrived an escape, perhaps, but it's been too long. Orochimaru will be suspicious of you. You don't look like you've been a prisoner. Tenten shook her head. Then we sell it. We make it look like I have been a prisoner. Tenten, you know what that will entail, Deidara said, looking worried. You know what Orochimaru will expect. Wounds from torture, broken bones, torn nails, restraint marks, malnutrition, we can simulate those injuries, she said matter-of-factly. After this long they'll expect that I'd been raped. I'm sure Conan can help me come up with something convincing. Tenten, that's insane, you can't dash, Deidara exclaimed. Even if that worked, what happens when they delve into your mind to find out what you told us over the course of receiving those injuries? Sasori interrupted. All they'll find are mental fuinjutsu seals full of false memories you'll have placed in my mind, sensei. I know you're capable of making me believe the lies behind the wounds. That way I won't have to act, and whoever they send from the Yamanaka clan to dredge my memories will corroborate the cover story instead of disproving it. When Sasori didn't raise another objection, Deidara looked at him in disbelief. You can't be considering this. Then he turned back to Tenten. Tenten, there are other ways to get a spy into Kanahagakure, you don't have to do this. Tenten smiled sadly. I joined the Akatsuki to save Kanahagakure, Deidara. I couldn't live with myself if one of the few good people left in that village died because we asked them to do something I wasn't willing to do myself. She looked back to Sasori. I can do this. You know I can. Sasori considered that for a time. There is another issue at hand, which the leader will surely raise if I bring this proposal to him. If you were compromised, your knowledge of certain things, such as the location of this base and the nature of our plans, could fall into the wrong hands. Tenten shrugged. The same holds true for any member of the Akatsuki. You're not a full member yet, Sasori reminded her. Then make me a full member now. You said today I'm ready for the test. I said your progress exceeded my expectations, Sasori contradicted her. But I also don't know who the leader will pick to test you, and some of our members are still very dangerous for you to face. In another 8 months you'll be ready without a doubt, and probably sooner than that. The trial is no holds barred, Tenten, and if you fail, you'll die for nothing. Tenten's determination didn't waver. The same was true of the Jounin exam, but that didn't stop me. I'm willing to take the risk. It's less chancy than trying to recruit a new spy, and you know it. Both of you, she added, looking Deidara in the eye and daring him to challenge her. He looked seriously unhappy, but didn't contradict her and nodded reluctantly. Sasori rose to his feet. I will confer with the leader about your offer. His answer will be final. Tenten nodded in acceptance, and Sasori left her alone with Deidara in his apartment. Moving beside her, Deidara took her hand. Your confidence and courage is one of the things I like about you, Tenten, but I wish you weren't so dead set on doing this. I don't want to lose you, to the test or to your village. I don't want to go, Tenten admitted. Especially not now, she added, pressing a hand to his chest. But I know I'm right about this, and I can do a lot of good for the Akatsuki back in Kanahagakure. What about what's good for you? Have you been on an open-ended deep cover mission before? Deidara pressed, and Tenten shook her head guiltily. I've been trained for them, she said. Training doesn't prepare you for a mission like this, Deidara said insistently. You have to live the cover. You'll have to become the person you were before you came here and live that life every waking moment. You can't ever let it slip, because you'll be under suspicion for a long time even if you get past the initial inquest. I don't. Deidara looked away and let go of her hand. It's selfish of me, I'm sorry. Understanding dawned on Tenten. You think I'll forget about you, about us, once I'm back home? He nodded guiltily and she pressed a hand to his cheek, making him look at her. I understand, but please have faith in me. I may have to go and act like I haven't changed, but I have, and that's something I will never forget. You and Sasori have given me so much, a new life, a new purpose. You've given me the power to fight for the day when my home will be free of Orochimaru and I'll be free to come back to you. Every day I'm in Kanahagakure, I will look forward to that day, and that's a promise. Deidara enfolded her in his arms, crushing her to his chest, and that's how Sasori found them when he returned. Clearing his throat from the doorway, he waited for them to disentangle themselves. Tenten, the leader has agreed to allow you to be evaluated early. Tomorrow at noon you will be tested on your ability to become a full Akatsuki. As Sasori promised, a day later Tenten entered the chamber that housed the demonic statue of the Outer Path. Sasori and Deidara followed her, and in the gloom that surrounded the statue other members of the Akatsuki waited. Tenten was surprised to realize that all of them were physically here. She spotted some familiar faces. Haiden and Conan stood on the statue's knees, the avatar of Jashin giving her a friendly if worried smile. At least I won't have to fight him, Tenten thought. While the leader picked the member to evaluate an applicant at random, it was never the applicant's sponsor, the sponsor's partner, or Haiden. The sponsoring pair was viewed as insufficiently distanced from the applicant to come at them with true killing intent, and Haiden was incapable of killing someone who had not earned Jashin's wrath. That left a lot of other Akatsuki that the leader could pick from, though. The purple swirls of his Rinnegan gazed down from his spot on the statue's right hand. Tenten of Kanahagakure has petitioned to be allowed to undergo her trial and become a full Akatsuki early, in preparation for a mission to infiltrate her former village, which we have approved on the condition that she passes the trial. A few of the other Akatsuki reacted with visible surprise, including Conan. The blue-haired woman looked at Tenten with concern, but didn't intervene as Tenten stepped forward calmly, ready to face the test. For the first time since her capture she had the comforting weight of her main storage scroll on her back. She'd made herself a new one, incorporating improvements from the new techniques and seals Sasori had taught her. The leader's gaze turned to the statue's left hand, where two shadowed figures waited. Tenten could tell that the larger of the pair was Kisame, identifiable by his massive silhouette. She hadn't met his partner yet, a man of more normal proportions, and his face was hidden in shadow. It was that partner that the leader addressed. Itachi, will you do us the honor of evaluating your fellow expatriate of the Leaf Village? When Tenten heard that name, her breath froze in her throat. It can't be. What are the odds that he would be here? She heard Deidara swear quietly behind her. Kisame's partner jumped down from the statue's hand without a word, and as he fell into the torchlight of the lower chamber, Tenten's heart sank. The man looked like an older version of his brother Sasuke, a bit leaner and with a more deeply lined face, but the resemblance was undeniable, and the spinning, fully formed Sharingan locked onto her as he landed. Itachi, you have 3 minutes to kill her. Begin, the leader commanded. Chapter 9, Sharingan Deathmatch. Tenten among the Akatsuki, Month 4. Begin, the leader commanded. Before Uchiha Itachi's feet even hit the ground in front of her, Tenten looked away from his famous face. Rule number 1, make eye contact with a Sharingan and you're already dead. Once her initial fear at facing her village's most famous Nukenin faded, she realized that it could be worse. Yes, Itachi was a genius and one of the most dangerous shinobi alive, but she knew what to expect, at least. She knew how to fight a Sharingan user. She couldn't get complacent, and the gap between his skill and hers was so wide that her survival prospects for the next 3 minutes weren't looking very good, but at least she wasn't up against an opponent with abilities unknown to her, like Tobi or Kisame. Rule number 2, some of the Sharingan's tricks don't require eye contact. The instructions in Tenten's head were in Madogai's voice, because he was the one who had passed on his hard-won knowledge of how to counter Kanahagakure's deadliest dojutsu. Itachi didn't move right away, but Tenten felt something foreign ticking at the edges of her chakra network. It was masterfully subtle, but Tenten knew her own chakra too well not to notice it. Eyes narrowing, she interrupted her chakra flow for a moment, and felt the genjutsu dissipate before it even started to affect her. "Please, give me some credit," she told Itachi. "You're not getting into my head." In response, Itachi's fingers blurred as he formed hand signs faster than anyone Tenten had ever seen, including his younger brother, but she recognized the signs and guessed what was coming her way. Before dodging or forming a jutsu of her own, Tenten's hand dipped into her pouch and came out with a handful of smoke bombs that she hurled onto the ground between herself and Itachi. Rule number 3, if the Sharingan can see you, ninjutsu and taijutsu are pointless. The cloud of smoke was lit up with a ruddy orange light from Itachi's side, and Tenten knew she had about half a second before the man-sized fireball the Uchiha were so fond of hit her. She responded by hurling a kunai wrapped with a few explosive notes into its path before jumping back. Notes met fireball and detonated violently, dispelling the blazing attack, the shockwave propelling Tenten further back. Before she landed, she had a pair of small scrolls out of her pouch and leapt into the air as she unsealed them, letting the twin paper trails form a double helix around her as she rose up. Itachi darted through the smoke cloud below her, katana in hand and Sharingan locking back onto her. "Sorry Itachi, those eyes can't copy Fuinjutsu." Tenten forced her chakra into both scrolls, releasing their contents. One was a standard rising dragon scroll, and dozens of weapons started popping out of it, which Tenten hurled at Itachi with unerring accuracy. She didn't expect to hit him at this range, but her aim was good enough to prevent him from jumping at her, and that allowed the second scroll to do its work. Tenten grinned as it released dozens more smoke bombs that flew in every direction and detonated, filling the room with a thick haze. She could hear some coughing as the audience started retreating to escape. At the apex of her leap, she reached the statue's left hand and landed on it, noting that Kisame had surrounded himself with a shield of water vapor rather than retreat from the smoke. He grinned at her as she darted past him and jumped again, aiming for the ceiling this time. Landing upside down on the room's high ceiling, Tenten loosened her main ceiling scroll from the straps holding it on the small of her back and pressed it to the ceiling where she adhered it with chakra, running along the ceiling and unrolling it as she went. When an entire section was attached to the ceiling, it detached from the rest of the scroll, and she slung the rest of it back across her back. Then she had to kick off of the ceiling and drop into the smoke as Itachi emerged from the haze barreling towards her. She twisted in midair but still felt the cold kiss of steel as the tip of his blade scored the back of her left thigh. Then their opposing momentum separated them for a second, and Tenten righted herself, ignoring the blood dampening her pants from the sword cut. Far enough away from Itachi that he couldn't see her hand signs, she formed them as she fell, and when she landed with both feet hitting the ground hard, called, "Doton, Choyakuiwa." Itachi plummeted out of the smoke right at her, but instead of attacking he had to dodge or parry the dozen or so smaller stone projectiles that fired up from the floor around Tenten. One got past his defense and struck him in the shoulder, but instead of being wounded, Itachi disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Shadow clone. Tenten didn't waste any time trying to figure out which direction the real Itachi would be coming from, instead making the hand signs for her next technique as quickly as possible. Doton Mogiragakur no Jutsu. Hiding like a mole technique, Itachi's flashing blade passed over Tenten's head close enough to shave off some hairs from her buns as she dropped into the ground. A split second after the earth closed over her head, she felt a sting of a deep cut on her cheek as Itachi thrust his blade straight down into the stone after her, scoring her face before she sank deep enough that he couldn't hit her. Safe for the moment, Tenten considered her next move while she moved laterally through the ground. Itachi would undoubtedly be waiting wherever she emerged from the rock. Tenten formed a pair of rock clones around a handful of explosive tags from her pouch and equalized her chakra with them. Then she made a final set of hand signs, triggering the scroll she'd left attached to the ceiling. Pausing just long enough to draw her Tanto, Tenten and both of her clones emerged from the ground. Judging from the poofs of white smoke she saw, triggering the heavenly chain of destruction on the ceiling and calling down a rain of fast-moving weapons had dispelled more of Itachi's clones. A pair of kunai hid one of her rock clones, which detonated spectacularly. A spray of small fireballs destroyed the other clone a moment later with a similarly pyrotechnic result, and then Tenten found herself under attack once more. Tenten blocked a few of Itachi's lightning-fast strikes with the tanto before missing a parry and feeling his blade open a gash on her left arm. "Any more tricks?" Itachi inquired conversationally as he drove her back in a steady retreat from the whirling storm of death his katana had become. "Oh, lots," Tenten panted. "You sure you should be breathing this smoke?" she inquired, referring to the haze that still filled the room. It was a bluff, but it made him hesitate, which gave Tenten the moment she needed to tear open her grenade pouch and hurl half a dozen spiked metal balls in his direction. Itachi leapt away while Tenten dropped to one knee and pressed a hand to the floor, exerting her earth chakra without hand signs to pull up a waist-high wall of rock to shield herself from the explosion that showered her surroundings with shrapnel. Then she was rolling away into the haze as Itachi closed in from a new angle. Tenten had been keeping time in her head, and Itachi's window was running out, but she couldn't get overconfident. She was bleeding from cuts on her arm, leg and face, and she was running out of ninja tools and chakra. The problem came into focus when two more Itachis shot out of the haze from different directions, one unleashing a storm of fist-sized fireballs at her while the other closed with its sword. Tenten threaded her body through the rain of fire in a leaping dodge and felt the cold kiss of Itachi's blade slicing her right shoulder open. That clone succeeded in dodging a kick to the head but failed to avoid a tanto strike to the chest that made it vanish in a puff of smoke. A kick from the remaining Itachi caught Tenten in the stomach before she landed, and she fell into a roll away from Itachi as his blade clanged off of the floor. Struggling for breath, Tenten got to her feet and transferred her tanto to her left hand as she started losing feeling in the right. A quick glance at her shoulder showed that the cut was deep, down to the bone, and blood was flowing down her limp arm. With Itachi closing in again, and blood loss becoming a serious issue, Tenten needed something to give her some more time, and she grimaced. "Kami, I hate doing this," she thought before reaching into her own chakra network and wrenching open both of the inner gates at her command. Itachi's charge faltered as Tenten's chakra expanded, wreathing her body in a pale green glow. Her eyes turned pure white, and her hair burst free from its buns, surrounding her head in a shimmering halo for a moment before falling free around her shoulders, moving in waves as her chakra pulsed against it. Strength flowed into her body from the gate of opening, and the gate of healing caused her muscle fibers to flex and draw her wounds closed for the time being. Tenten battled the sense of euphoria that came with the opening of inner gates, focusing on Itachi, who took less than a second to react to Tenten's actions before inclining his head in respect and blurring through hand signs that formed two more clones that charged her while he hurled a handful of shuriken at her that turned into a cloud of dozens after another jutsu. Tenten simply made use of her enhanced strength to jump straight up before the clones or shuriken got close, deflecting a few kunai with her tanto before reaching the ceiling, flipping and kicking off of that in a new direction, leaving the pursuing clones behind. Reaching the wall, she stuck to it for a fraction of a second before throwing a few kunai at where Itachi had been standing, then jumping back towards the ceiling in the direction she'd come. As expected, the clones were in hot pursuit, but not prepared for her to be engaging them, when she'd spent the length of the bout trying to avoid Itachi. One took a kick to the head that snapped its neck around 180 degrees, while the other got a tanto slash that opened up its neck before momentum carried Tenten past them. Tenten's only warning was twin flashes of light behind her as the clones exploded violently instead of dissipating. She couldn't avoid the shockwave, which added to her momentum and knocked her out of position. She hit the ceiling with painful force, and then was falling through the smoke. Struggling to right herself, Tenten was kicked from behind and above by the real Itachi, and hit the ground poorly, biting back a cry of pain as bones in her right leg broke from the landing. Pushing past the pain, she rolled to the side as Itachi descended, driving the blade of his katana down where her torso had been, slicing open a long gash along a rib. He dodged a handful of shuriken with contemptuous ease, then his foot came down on her broken leg, hard, and Tenten screamed, her vision blurring from the pain as she saw Itachi draw back his blade and thrust at her head. She threw up her arm, gasping as the razor blade slid between the bones of her forearm, the bloody tip emerging and sliding inexorably toward her. "Time," the leader's voice said as it emerged from the smoke that filled the room, and even though Tenten heard it, she found it difficult to focus on anything other than the tip of the katana blade centimeters from her left eye, her own blood running down its length and dripping onto her face from her skewered arm. Breaking rule number 1, she looked Itachi in the eye, and saw the knowledge in his spinning tomo. None of the other Akatsuki could see them. He could finish the thrust into her brain and none of them would know. But he didn't. Instead, he knelt, took a hold of her wrist and carefully drew his blade out of her arm without widening the wound before stepping back. Figures in the haze resolved into members of the Akatsuki, who closed around her in a ring, and she saw some of their faces for the first time, including Zetsu, whose Venus flytrap head was weird enough that Tenten wasn't sure she wasn't hallucinating. Her breath caught when she saw that the leader had also revealed himself, a tall young man with a number of thick metal piercings who almost looked like Naruto, but older and with orange hair instead of blonde, his Rinnegan staring into her soul. Sasori and Kakuzu moved forward as Tenten lost hold of the inner gates and her wounds started bleeding again. Sasori started bandaging some wounds and feeding green healing chakra into them, while Kakuzu's black threads started knitting others together. As soon as she lost the gates, the pain hit all over her body, from dozens of sprains and muscle tears. This was the part she hated about the inner gates, and Niji shared her opinion that Guy and Lee were both masochists at heart to use them in combat so often. Adding in the pain of her other wounds, the broken leg knitting as Sasori mended it and the lost blood, Tenten considered it a victory that she was managing not to pass out as the leader weighed her with those impossible eyes. Itachi, is she fit to be one of us in truth? The leader posed the question, and Tenten's breath caught in her throat. The rules of the test had been survival, but another second and she would have been dead. Sharingan met Rinnegan, and Itachi shrugged before breaking the leader's gaze, producing a rag from under his robe and using it to clean her blood from his sword. It's been 3 minutes and she's still alive. I wasn't holding back. That was all he said before sheathing his sword. So be it. Tenten, welcome to the true Akatsuki, the leader said. Deidara slipped her good arm over his shoulder and helped her to her feet, steadying her as she got her balance. She shook the leader's hand when he offered it amid murmured congratulations from Haiden, Kisame, Konan and her mentors. Konan handed her a folded cloak with the red clouds embroidered on it. Thank you, Tenten replied gratefully, to the leader and the others. I won't let you down. With nods of acknowledgement, most of them dispersed, though Sasori, Deidara, Kakuzu, Haiden and Konan lingered. Tenten looked at the cloak in her arms and then at Deidara, who wore a relieved smile. This is an honor, but unfortunately I can't wear it or risk having it in my possession where I'm going. Reaching up with her free hand, Tenten untied her scored leaf hitayate and put it on top of the cloak before extending both to Deidara. Will you hold on to these for me until the day I come back for them? Deidara looked at the items, then her, his eyes a mystery as he took them in his hands. Of course, he replied. Then Kakuzu's meaty hand clapped her on the shoulder he had just finished sewing back together and she winced at the fresh pain. Sasori's filled us in on your plan, he informed her in an amused tone. And you're crazy for coming up with it, Konan added tartly. But since Itachi's already done half the work of making you look like you're on death's door, there's no time like the present to finish the job, Kakuzu concluded. Come on, step into my parlor and we'll give you a look that will give your friends back in the Leaf Village nightmares. Tenten swallowed hard as Kakuzu's arm engulfed her shoulders and he guided her towards his quarters, Haiden and Konan trailing behind. As long as it doesn't give me nightmares, Tenten shot back. Kakuzu's harsh laughter was not reassuring. I'm going to get started on the necessary seals, Tenten, Sasori informed her. They'll be ready by the time Kakuzu and Konan are done. Great, Tenten muttered, limping along and trying not to think about how much pain she was already in, and how much more she had signed up for. Chapter 10, Tactics of Trust. Second round of the Chunin exam. Amaya, Ken and Keed sat quietly around a cheery fire fed by drywood from a large stack at the back of the shelter, a natural cave that had been expanded by hand. A narrow, twisting cleft in the rock above allowed the smoke to escape without much snow getting in, and the only entry to the cave was a winding tunnel that opened out behind a row of high, thorny hedges. They never would have found the cave without their map, but with it they were warm, dry, and their packs were full of supplies. When they reached the first shelter on the map, they had taken as much food and other useful supplies as they could carry without sacrificing speed before moving on. They were now in the second shelter near the far edge of the forest, less than a day's journey from the pass that lead up into the mountains. They'd beaten the storm there by hours. Now it howled like a mad demon outside, audible even in their well-concealed shelter. Even with the storm raging, they had taken precautions. The tunnel in was lined with traps and sentry bugs. Amaya was confident there wasn't a genin in the competition that could sneak up on them here. As soon as the storm blew over, they'd be on their way and on the hunt for another team 2/3 of their competition was likely to be worn out or even injured if they hadn't found some manner of protection from the storm. The mood around the fire should have been jubilant, but instead it was tense. None of them had spoken while preparing and eating dinner, and now that the food was done, the quiet had become painful. "Why did you do it, Amaya?" Ken finally asked, laying out the uncomfortable question. Keith's silvery eyes searched Amaya's features as well from behind her dark glasses and hood. Amaya grimaced, but didn't answer right away. Sighing, Ken looked at Keith. "I know why she did it," Keith said slowly. "I simply do not know if it was the right choice or not, and I would have preferred some discussion of that course of action before it was taken." Once they'd raided the first shelter, the log cabin in a hidden thicket, Keith and Ken were back in the trees when they realized Amaya wasn't with them. Turning back, they had seen what she intended, but were too far away to stop her. Making familiar hand signs, she called out "Katun, Gokaku, Great Fireball," and unleashed a flaming orb from her lips that swelled to be as tall as she was before hitting the cabin, setting the dry logs of its walls ablaze. She gave the building one glance to make sure it was well ablaze and then sprinted for her stunned teammates. "Amaya, what the hell?" Ken had exclaimed. "I'll explain later, we need to move now, before the smoke draws our competition," was all she said before taking to the trees and making top speed towards the mountains in the distance. Exchanging a troubled look, Ken and Keith had no choice but to follow Amaya, and the pace she set left little room for talk. Twice Keith's bug scouts ahead of them gave them bare warning of approaching teams that they avoided by stealth or speed. There wasn't time to discuss it, Keith. "You know we were working against the clock," Amaya answered. "That would be an acceptable explanation if I thought for a moment you hadn't planned to do that as soon as you saw the map," Keith shot back. "That wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, Amaya. You intended to destroy the first shelter before we left the starting point." Ken looked back and forth between them. "Why destroy it at all?" Amaya pinched the bridge of her nose and sighed before getting out the map and laying it out on a rock. Ken and Keith moved closer. There were 3 shelters in the forest. 2 near the starting area in the west, and this one here on the east side of the forest near the mountain pass. They both nodded. Keith drew a kanji 4 fire over the northwest one that she'd burned. "I destroyed that first shelter because there are 3 other teams out there with the same map we have. Since we got to the northwest shelter before any of them, it was good odds that we were faster than any of them, unless some of them headed to the southwest shelter. Since we barely beat the storm here and no one's found this one either, none of the other teams with supply maps got this far, so they all had to double back to avoid the storm. If we'd left the northwest shelter intact, there would have been 2 options for those 3 teams. But since the northwest shelter was destroyed in such a visible manner, all 3 of those teams now have to fight over the southwest shelter. Given the slim chances of 3 Cloud or Mist teams having the 3 other supply maps, burning the northwest shelter means some of our opponents will have to fight each other to stay warm tonight. I did it to eliminate at least 1 and maybe 2 other teams without throwing a single punch or kunai." When she finished, Ken was looking at Amaya with a look somewhere between admiration and horror. What if one of those teams with supply maps didn't see the smoke or didn't realize what it meant, and is trapped in this storm now because of it? Keith inquired. "You could be responsible for the deaths of other genin." "I can live with that," Amaya answered, and Ken's jaw dropped. "How can you say that?" he asked, stricken. "Where do you think we are, Ken?" Amaya snapped. "We don't have any friends out here. Konohamaru wouldn't hesitate to attack us because he's an arrogant prick, and Sensei wasn't lying about the Inuzukas. They'd murder us given half a chance. So would the foreign genin. I'm not going to mourn any other team that dies in this storm, because that's 1 less team gunning for us, and 1 less team to face in the finals." "Amaya," Keith said sharply. "You have no place to speak to Ken like that." Amaya and Ken both looked at Keith in surprise. The Aburame rarely raised her voice or spoke in such a tone. "Nor was it your place to make the decision to destroy the shelter without talking to us about it. We agreed when Tenten Sensei first became our teacher that our squad wouldn't be ruled by fiat as Konohamaru is. You agreed to that. So you think we should have left that shelter standing?" Amaya demanded. "No, my earlier question was rhetorical," Keith replied evenly. "I agree with your analysis of our situation and I agree with your goal in destroying the shelter, but your method was foolhardy. If you had discussed your plan with us we could have accomplished your goals more effectively." "Really?" How? Keed began ticking off fingers. We could have poisoned the remaining food instead of burning it. We could have set traps in and around the cabin. My Kikai bugs could have weakened the timber of the cabin enough that it would have collapsed during the storm. All of these things could have been done quickly and with more subtlety than blowing up the shelter with a big fireball. We were almost caught by other teams twice because of the smoke signal you created. By the time Keed finished, Ken was giving her the same disturbed look Amaya had gotten minutes earlier. Those are all good ideas, Amaya conceded, her temper cooling. You have lots of good ideas, Keed, so why didn't you suggest any of that when we were raiding the shelter? Keed shrugged. I kept my thoughts to myself in the interest of team unity. I suspected Ken would have objected to the plan, and judging by the way he looks right now, I'd say that was correct. Ken nodded reluctantly as both girls looked at him. I try to think of what Lee-sensei and Tenten-sensei would do, he said quietly. I understand, Amaya admitted. Truth is, I almost didn't do it. But Ken, Tenten-sensei was an active duty kunoichi before she became our sensei. She's conducted assassinations. She's helped end sieges, and the usual way to do that is to sneak inside the fort and poison the wells. All of our teachers have had to get their hands dirty, even Lee-sensei. It's part of being a ninja. Amaya sighed. But Keed, you're right. I'm sorry I acted without talking to you guys. Apology accepted, Keed said quietly, and Ken nodded jerkily. Amaya is right too, Ken. Consider this, do you think Lee and Tenten would rather that we fought effectively and lived to see them, or fought honorably and died far from home? Ken considered that. I think Lee-sensei would say that the purpose of our strength is to avoid that duality, to be strong enough to fight honorably and win. That's what I'm working for. Fair enough, Keed admitted. I only hope you won't think less of us for being sneaky on occasion. Ken started stammering a denial before he saw Keed's faint smile and realized that the Aburame girl was teasing him. Amaya chuckled, then got to her feet and picked up her warm, long coat, putting it on and wrapping a scarf around her face. I'm going to go scout around the entrance. I won't go far. Before she left, she gave Keed the plaque and map. Then she headed down the tunnel, avoiding the traps they'd set. From the cave mouth she saw the tall bushes concealing the entrance whipping back and forth in the howling wind. Mindful of the thorns, she activated her Sharingan and waited for a lull in the wind to dart out between the bushes. The next gale almost knocked Amaya off of her feet before she gripped the dense, wet snow with chakra in her boot soles. She quickly made her way behind the thick bole of a tree for shelter from the wind and scanned the forest. The shelter was on a small hill with a decent view of the surrounding forest. From her vantage point, Amaya's Sharingan scanned the area around her. Without her clan's dojutsu she would have been almost blind. The clouds blotted out the moon, and only occasional flashes of lightning broke the gloom. But her uncle Sasuke had taught her the trick for operating in darkness with the Sharingan. If she focused on it, the afterimage of the illuminated landscape from the lightning flashes remained in her vision even when the dark returned. It didn't allow her to track motion, of course, but it was superb for darting from tree to tree, sheltering from the wind and driving snow as she circled the hill. Halfway around the hill, Amaya spotted a point of orange light just under a kilometer away, coming from a thick stand of oak trees. She studied it long enough to realize that it wasn't a fire caused by a lightning strike. The light was too steady. It had to be another team of genin, trying to keep warm in the storm. They obviously didn't have a supply map, or they'd already have attacked. Amaya contemplated the idea of getting Keed and Ken, but dismissed the thought. It was too far a distance for her nightblind teammates to cover, but that didn't mean Amaya couldn't scout out who was there and get some intel so they could attack in the morning. Making up her mind, Amaya headed for the distant light, suppressing her chakra as Tenten had taught her and moving noiselessly through the shadows. When she got close, she started moving only when the wind howled and the sky was dark. It made for slow progress, but she got close without alerting her quarry. Having slowly crawled through some bushes on her belly, Amaya peered into the rough camp. There were 3 genin huddled around a small fire that flickered and wavered in the cold wind that penetrated even into the dense thicket where they'd taken shelter. The tan leather of their coats, the bandages wrapped around the taller boy, and the hitayate of the kunoichi identified them as hailing from Sunagakure. They don't have any allies either, Amaya reflected. Only one team of Sand Genin had made it into the second round, and they hadn't crossed paths with Team Tenten so far in the exam. All three were bundled up against the cold enough that their features and gear were hidden, but as she studied them, Amaya's eyes narrowed. When the Sand Kunoichi leaned forward to warm her hands, Amaya spotted the outline of two small battle fans on her belt. She had bandages wrapped around her head above her hitayate, but Amaya glimpsed brown hair sticking out in places. Probably a wind user, Amaya concluded. The shorter and stockier of the two boys wore a hooded black suit under his winter coat and white-on-red face paint, and had a bandage-wrapped package as tall as he was sitting next to him, and he seemed as concerned for its well-being as his own. Definitely a puppeteer. The third one was a tall, slender boy who was bandaged like a mummy. His whole head save for his dark eyes and his arms and legs were all wrapped under a sangenin outfit and warm overclothes. Amaya couldn't guess his specialty. Wait a minute. Brown-haired kunoichi with battle fans, a puppeteer built like an Akimichi and bandage boy? Couldn't be. Then all doubt was removed when the wind and snow extinguished the small, struggling fire. A moment later light returned, not yellow but red, a head-sized glowing orb hovering over the hand of the tall, bandaged genin and radiating heat. The other two threw damp, snowy wood in the fire pit before their companion tossed his red ball after it. A hissing cloud of steam erupted from the pit, and the wood, suddenly dry, started burning fiercely. No way! Team Sand Crabs here in the exams. Amaya realized with shock. Unlike Leaf Genin teams, Sand Genin were named after a desert animal mascot instead of their Jounin sensei, and Team Tenten knew this group of Sand Genin. They'd shared a room in the barracks for months in Sunagakure. The kunoichi was a wind specialist named Sira, the puppeteer was a doleful boy named Po, and their tall leader was Raul, the son of Sunagakure's most famous kunoichi and heir to its most formidable Kekkei Genkai. His mother was Pakura, a living legend of the sand, and he commanded the fearsome Scorch Release, a deadly combination of fire and air chakra natures. His usual costume wrapped in bandages was a grim homage to his Kekkei Genkai, which could mummify enemies instantly. Amaya reassessed her plans. Even in an ambush and with her team warm and better rested, attacking Raul's team was a dicey prospect. Their only chance would be to kill or incapacitate Raul before he knew he was under attack, anything less and they'd all be at his mercy. Amaya had one untested counter to the Scorch Release that might work or might get her killed. But thinking about it, Amaya realized that the situation wasn't as bad as she'd first thought. Looking at Raul, she could see signs of fatigue in his slumped posture. Sunagakure ninja were no strangers to cold, but their desert country didn't have winter storms like this, and they were plainly unprepared for the savagery of the weather. Raul had to be burning a lot of chakra keeping his team from freezing, but Ken predicted the storm would last for another day at least. By then Raul would probably be tapped out and his teammates short on sleep, they'd be easy pickings. The three of them might even die in the storm and remove the need to fight at all. But despite her earlier callousness in burning the northwest shelter, Amaya felt her stomach turn at the prospect of waiting for the Sangenin to die and looting their frozen corpses. Team Tenten and Team Rock Crab had been friends in Sunagakure, had sparred together, and while the Chunin exams were adversarial by nature, Amaya was reminded of her initial thought upon seeing what village they were from. Like Team Tenten, Team Sand Crab didn't have any allies in the exam. Maybe we can change that. Crawling backward out of the bush she had been hiding under, Amaya circled around to the far side of their camp, hiding behind a tree. Now I just have to get their attention without getting killed. Hello the camp, she called. As soon as they heard her all three were on their feet, putting their backs to the fire. Sira's fans came out, Po's puppet leapt free of its bindings and Raul had a pair of scorch orbs in hand. I just want to talk, Raul. It's Amaya, from Kanahagakure. Raul spotted her first, as she peered out from behind the tree, ready to run like hell if he showed any sign of tossing a ball of death at her. Raul didn't throw his orbs at her. Sira and Po didn't turn, keeping an eye out for Keed and Ken. Amaya, is it? I'm listening, Raul replied in his odd, flowing accent. You guys look to be in a bad spot, she observed. Less than you think, Raul shot back. The Scorch Release works as well on wet wood as it does on opportunistic Leaf Genin. We're doing fine. Raul sounded confident enough that he might have fooled her, but he didn't know that Amaya had unlocked her Sharingan since their last meeting. Even in the gloom she could see the faint tremors in his hands. He wasn't far from chakra exhaustion. Storms in the land of lightning don't end quickly, you know, Amaya pointed out from her shelter behind the tree. It wasn't Raul who spoke next, but Stocky Poe. You wouldn't be talking to us if you planned to ambush us. What do you want, Amaya? I'd prefer not to have you three freezing to death on my conscience, to be honest, Amaya shot back, and was surprised to realize she meant it. If you'll agree not to attack my team, we'll do the same and you can join us in the shelter we've been staying in until the storm passes. Then we go our separate ways. Is that acceptable to you? You want to lead us into a trap, you mean? Sarah shot back tartly. Oh, we set up plenty of traps, Sarah, but not for you. Poe already said it. If we wanted to fight you, we could have ambushed you, or just waited until tomorrow when Raul's got no chakra left to fight with because he's been lighting fires all night. Raul let his scorch orbs fade. Alright, we accept your offer. To their credit, Sarah and Poe didn't argue, packing up their gear quickly. Like Raul, they probably realized they had nothing to lose and a lot to gain. Amaya was the one taking the risk that they wouldn't attack her team once they were in the shelter. The only reason she was confident they'd keep their word was that even once he had the chance to rest, Raul wouldn't be back to 100% for a few days if he was already suffering tremors, and he wasn't reckless enough to attack her team when they were better rested. Amaya stepped out from behind the tree and led the Sangenin through the woods to the hill that hid the entrance to the shelter cave. Holding up a hand, Amaya ducked her head in the tunnel entrance. Amaya, Ken, I'm back with some guests. Found the sand crabs out in the snow, she called. A few moments passed before Ken came into view holding a torch, a guarded expression on his face as he studied the Sangenin. Hey, guys, he commented, before glancing at Amaya. How's the weather out there? He inquired. Oh, just peachy, Amaya replied, and Ken relaxed a bit. Peachy was their all-clear code word. If Amaya had called the weather fierce, Keed would start triggering traps and unleashing her hive while Ken attacked. Instead, he gestured for them to follow before heading back the way he'd come. Keed was waiting for them when they got to the shelter cave. She'd built up the fire and gotten out some more food. The Sangenin abandoned any pretense at a defensive posture to crowd around the blaze. Raul sat down and unwound the bandages around his head. Underneath them he had nut-brown skin and features with a foreign cast that matched his odd accent. His forehead was marked with 3 vertical red dots in the center, not paint but tattoos. When Team Tenten had met him, they'd noticed how much he stood out in Sunagakure, where the natives were all pale-skinned. They learned his story once he got to know them and invited them to his home to meet his family. Eating dinner with the legendary Pakura was heady enough, but Team Tenten had found Raul's father and the story of his marriage to Pakura equally intriguing. When Pakura had begun to feel the desire to marry and start a family, she had faced a problem. She was determined to marry someone who saw her as a wife and not just a duty, but in Sunagakure most men were afraid of her, and the matches the Sand Council found were all political or unpalatable to her. So Pakura had convinced the Yondaime Kazekage, Gaara's father, to allow her to leave the village for a time to find a husband to bring back to Sunagakure. The Kazekage allowed it, not out of sentimentality, but because Pakura was one of the few people in his village he feared. Pakura had traveled far to the west of the Land of Wind, leaving the elemental nations entirely. In a distant land she met Raul's father, Rickard, a mercenary and native of that distant land. They had come to love one another, and with few ties to his homeland, Rickard had agreed to marry Pakura and settle in Sunagakure. Rickard wore a bushy, trimmed beard, and his skin was a deep, rich brown. He had a tattoo on his forehead like Raul's, though his was a set of 9 dots in a square. Among his people the number of dots signified achievements in life. Thought I'd never be warm again, Sarah muttered by the fire, rubbing her slender hands together by the flames. Once Keat had some soup warming up over the fire, she glanced at Amaya. I thought we just had a conversation about making decisions without consulting the team, she said, but there was no sting to the statement. Amaya shrugged unrepentantly. Do you object? Studying the Sangenin, Keat shook her head. No, it's fine. Raul looked up from where he was sitting by the fire. Thank you, all of you. You didn't have to take the risk of offering us shelter, and I appreciate that you did. We lived together and trained together. Even if we are in the Chunin exam, that doesn't mean we have to be enemies, Ken observed, at least not in this round. Once the soup was ready the Sangenin ate with vigor, all 3 offering their thanks again. Once the food was set aside, Poe looked at the leaf genin thoughtfully. You're alone out here, aren't you? I'm surprised you didn't team up with the other squads from your village. Amaya and Keed exchanged a silent glance before Keed nodded in assent. Honestly, the other two teams from our village aren't trustworthy, Amaya admitted, not seeing the harm. The Sand Genin weren't going to tell anyone. One group's led by an egomaniac who would attack us out of spite, and the other's a homicidal bunch who don't get along with anyone outside their clan. If we see them, we'll probably have to fight them. Raul and Poe looked at each other, then Amaya. Well, we're in a similar situation. We're the only Sunagakure team that made it to this round. 2 other teams from our village failed the interrogation room test. Amaya nodded. Would you be interested in sharing maps? I know you don't have the supply one. Raul considered it and then nodded to Syrah, who produced her map. Keed unfolded theirs, and the 2 girls set them side by side, getting out pencils and copying information from each other. One glance told Amaya that Raul's team had the trail map, which had a number of routes through the forest and mountains traced out, along with topographical information. Syrah marked down the shelters long before Keed was done getting the trail data. It probably doesn't matter at this point, but that shelter's gone, Ken pointed out to Syrah. What happened to it? The Sand Kunoichi asked. I burned it once we raided it, Amaya admitted. Raul's eyebrows went up. That was you. When Amaya nodded, he grinned. Good idea. There was a big battle in the area of the other shelter this afternoon. We avoided it so we didn't see who won, but we could see and hear it from far away. Lots of water flying through the air and the ground was shaking, so there was at least one team from Mist and Rock. Amaya considered that. Good to know. Then she yawned, and by the time it stopped, Poe and Syrah were yawning too. Why don't we turn in? It's late. Split watches, she asked Raul, who nodded. Poe and Ken first, Amaya and I second, Syrah and Keed third? Raul suggested, and Amaya nodded in agreement. Each pair was roughly equal in strength, minimizing chances for mischief. Poe and Ken moved to spots where they could see the entrance and each other, while the rest got their bedrolls ready. The storm did indeed last another full day, but the shelter had more than enough food and firewood for both teams, so the time passed in relative comfort. They all chafed at the delay, but since the storm was affecting every team in the exam equally, they could live with it. They passed the time catching up on events since they last met and playing games. During that idle day, Keed suggested what Amaya had been thinking since she saw Team Sand Crab out in the snow. We've established that neither of our teams has much hope of making alliances elsewhere, she stated. Raul, who was playing shogi with her, nodded in agreement. Why don't we agree to make this truce an alliance with the goal of getting both of our teams into the final round? Syrah looked up from a book she was reading. Won't that force us to hunt down at least twice as many enemies? It would, but it's probably worth it, Poe offered. Your Leaf friends may have teamed up. It's possible the Rock or Mist Genin have made pacts, and I'd be shocked if the Cloud Genin didn't have an agreement. That was my thinking as well, Keed confirmed. Raul was silent for a little while, staring at the shogi board. Syrah's right, it is a lot more work, he observed before making his move, and we'll be a bigger target. But 2 teams from different villages fighting together and doing it well are also the last thing anyone will be expecting, and that alone could make it worthwhile. He looked at Amaya. Are you on board with this? Amaya nodded. It's been on my mind since I found you 3. Besides, even if we got our plaques separately, we still don't know where the entrance to the testing area is. If we stick together, we only have to get that information once between us. Remembering earlier conversations, Amaya looked to Ken. You okay with a team up? Ken chuckled. Sure. Poe convinced me last night. Raul gave the stocky puppeteer an arch look, and Poe had the grace to look embarrassed. If we're teaming up, there's something I should show you, Amaya said, and when all 3 Sangenin were looking at her, she activated her Sharingan. She hadn't progressed past 2 Tomoparai since unlocking it, but the trio looked impressed anyways. Raul whistled quietly. Congratulations, Amaya, he said sincerely. Then a nasty grin crossed his face. Sharingan and Scorch release, the other teams won't know what hit them. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.